Welcome to tonight's story. This tale will be accompanied by the soothing crackle of a fireplace to help you drift off to sleep. Before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. Leave a comment below. It's fascinating to see how our community spans different time zones, all gathered around our virtual fireplace, seeking a peaceful night's rest. Now, make yourself comfortable, adjust your volume, and let the warm sounds of the crackling fire and story guide you into peaceful dreams. Our story begins.
The radio station sat alone on the edge of Pine Valley, its transmission tower rising like a skeletal finger against the winter sky. Abigail Mills pulled her car into the empty parking lot, snow crunching under the tires. After 15 years in major markets, taking the night shift at WPVA felt like career suicide, but she needed to get away after what happened in Chicago. The station manager had left the key under the mat as promised. Inside, the building smelled of old coffee and electronics. The control room was a time capsule of analog equipment, reel-to-reel machines, vinyl turntables, and a mixing board that had seen better days. Just keep the overnight show running and don't mess with the automated system, the manager had said. Whatever happens, don't take any call-in requests between 2 and 4 a.m. That was the first red flag. The second was the thick ledger she found in the desk drawer, filled with entries dating back to 1963. January 15, 1963, 3:17 a.m. Called requested beyond the sea. Signal interference. Screaming on line 2. February 28, 1963, 2:45 a.m. Unknown caller. Static. Words in unknown language. March 13, 1963, 3:33 a.m. They're getting closer. God help us all. The entries continued through decades, each overnight DJ documenting strange occurrences during the dead hours. The most recent entry was from last week, November 22, 2023. Don't answer. They're not human anymore. The frequency is a door and they're coming through. I can hear them in the static. Whatever you do, don't play their requests. Abigail's first show started normally enough. She played the required rotation of classic rock, made her station IDs, and watched the meters dance on the aging equipment. At 1:59 a.m., the phone lines lit up all at once. She let them ring, remembering the warning. But as the digital clock ticked toward 2 a.m., the calls kept coming. The temperature in the control room dropped steadily until she could see her breath. Static began creeping into the broadcast signal, despite the clear night sky. At 2:33 a.m., the automation system kicked in, but instead of the scheduled songs, it began playing fragments of old broadcasts, snippets of news reports, weather updates, and commercials from decades ago. Between the fragments, she could hear voices whispering in the static. They were calling her name. The reel-to-reel machines started spinning on their own, playing backwards. Through the studio window, she saw impossible shapes moving in the darkness around the transmission tower. The phone lines were still ringing. At 3:15 a.m., the power went out. In the sudden silence, Abigail heard something climbing the tower outside, metal groaning under impossible weight. The emergency lights cast red shadows that moved wrong. The control board crackled to life without power, static pouring from the speakers. In the white noise, voices spoke. "Let us in, Abigail. We've been waiting so long. The frequency is almost open. Just answer the phone. Just one call." Through the static, she began to make out a pattern, fragments of broadcasts spanning decades, all leading to this night. Every DJ who had worked the overnight shift had been part of some vast, slow-moving ritual. The station itself was an antenna, not just for radio waves, but for something else, something that had been trying to cross over since the first broadcast. The LED meters on the control board pulsed in patterns that hurt her eyes. Each flash seemed to tear at the fabric of reality, creating momentary glimpses of somewhere else, a vast dark space filled with twisted antenna towers and forgotten frequencies. The station's signal coverage map hung on the wall, showing WPVA's broadcast radius. But now the lines were moving, forming spiral patterns that centered on the station. Similar spirals appeared in old coverage maps in the logbook, each one slightly larger, as if something had been slowly expanding its influence over decades. Abigail found a USB drive taped to the back of the logbook. It contained audio files labeled only with dates, spanning back to the station's first broadcast. She plugged it into the ancient computer and hit play. The earliest recording was mostly static, but beneath it, something was speaking. Each subsequent recording contained more voices, clearer words. The most recent was from last week, a chorus of impossible voices chanting in unison. The towers are our bridges. The frequencies are our paths. Every broadcast brings us closer. Every listener opens the way. At midnight on the longest night, when all stations align, we will manifest fully. No more static. No more interference. Only us. The winter solstice was tonight. Abigail checked the broadcasting schedule. At midnight, every radio station in a 100-mile radius would synchronize for the annual holiday broadcast, something that had happened every year since 1963. She'd seen similar events scheduled in Chicago and other markets. The ledger's entries suddenly made horrifying sense. This wasn't just happening at WPVA. Every radio station was an anchor point, every broadcast a strand in a vast web. For 60 years, something had been using the nation's radio networks to create a pattern of cosmic significance. Outside, the shapes around the tower were becoming more solid. In the red emergency lighting, she could see them climbing, their bodies a twisted mass of antenna arrays and radio components given impossible life. The static from the speakers had become a physical presence, coalescing into tendrils that reached for her. The phone lines were still ringing. At 3:45 a.m., the computer began playing all the archived recordings simultaneously. The overlapping voices formed new words. We are the spaces between stations. We are the voices in white noise. We have been broadcasting since before your species learned to speak. Tonight, we take physical form. Answer the phone, Abigail. Be our final connection. The temperature had dropped so low that frost covered the windows. Through the ice crystals, Abigail saw more shapes emerging from the darkness. Things that looked almost human, but assembled from radio parts and broadcasting equipment. Their movements were jerky, like badly tuned transmissions. They were all former DJs, she realized. Everyone who had answered the calls during the dead hours had become part of the station's architecture, transformed into living antennas for whatever was trying to break through. And at midnight, when all stations synchronized, the pattern would be complete. The station's archives contained records of equipment malfunctions dating back decades. Every piece of replaced hardware had been stored in the basement, hundreds of old microphones, speakers, and circuit boards. As Abigail descended the stairs, she heard them humming. The basement was alive with electricity. Old equipment had assembled itself into grotesque shapes that approximated human forms. Vacuum tubes pulsed like hearts, wires twisted like veins, and speakers whispered with the voices of long-dead broadcasters. A massive shape dominated the center of the room, a towering construct of radio equipment that reached to the ceiling. At its core, she saw the station's first transmitter from 1963, its dials moving on their own. The logbook's final pages revealed the truth. The station hadn't been built here by accident. In 1963, something had fallen from the sky, not a meteor, but a pattern. A broadcast from somewhere beyond known space. The station's founders had built WPVA to study it, not understanding they were creating a receiver for something that had been waiting eons to be heard. The phone kept ringing upstairs. Checking her phone, Abigail discovered every station's signal was degrading simultaneously. The static was spreading, consuming all frequencies. In an hour, when the synchronized broadcast began, the pattern would be complete. She found an old reel-to-reel recording labeled First Contact, 1963. The tape contained a conversation between the station's founder and something that spoke through bursts of static. We are the signal. We are the spaces between thoughts. Your species creates networks, neural, electronic, broadcast. Each network is a door, each signal a key. We have waited in the static since the first spark of consciousness. Tonight, we manifest. The basement equipment surged with power. The construct in the center began broadcasting on all frequencies simultaneously, a signal that made Abigail's vision blur and her thoughts fragment. Through the static, she glimpsed its true form, a vast lattice of pure information that existed in the spaces between transmissions. The thing in the basement was just a receiver. The real horror was what waited on the other end of the signal. At 4:30 a.m., the emergency broadcast system activated nationwide. But instead of the usual test message, every speaker and radio produced the same static-laden chant. The doors are opening. The signal is strong. Your networks are our bridges. Your broadcasts are bodies. When midnight comes, we will be manifest. The construct was growing, absorbing equipment and transforming it into something that hurt to look at, angles that shouldn't exist, geometries that violated physics. It was building itself into a gateway. Abigail realized why the station manager had warned about taking requests. Each caller was another connection, another strand in the web. The thing in the static had been gathering voices, building its strength through decades of late-night broadcasts. The phone rang one final time. On the other end, she heard her own voice, distorted through layers of static. Answer us. Join us. Be our voice in your world. Through the basement window, she saw more constructs rising from other buildings, twisted towers of electronics and metal assembling themselves under the winter sky. The entire town was becoming a massive antenna array, aligning itself with similar patterns across the country. At midnight, everything would broadcast the same signal. Every speaker, every radio, every electronic device would become a doorway, and the things that had been hiding in the static would finally step through. The basement equipment pulsed faster as midnight approached. Abigail searched frantically through the archives, looking for anything that might help stop what was coming. In a sealed box marked contingency, she found an old journal belonging to the station's founder, Theodore Walsh. The final entry revealed a terrible choice. The only way to break the pattern was to destroy the original receiver, the station's first transmitter that now formed the heart of the basement construct. But doing so would kill everyone who had ever answered the phones during the dead hours. Their consciousness had become part of the signal, trapped between frequencies. The construct was now touching every floor of the station, its mass of electronics and metal spreading like roots through the building. The phone lines had melted into twisted copper tentacles that reached for her. From every speaker came the sound of voices she recognized. Former DJs, night shift workers, all of them now part of the pattern. "We're so close," they whispered through the static. Decades of careful broadcasting, every late-night request, every dead-air moment, every burst of interference, all building to this. When midnight comes, all frequencies will align. All stations will synchronize. The door will open fully. The temperature dropped further. Ice crystals formed in impossible patterns on every surface, creating fractals that mimicked broadcasting patterns. Through the basement window, Abigail saw the town's electrical grid coming alive, power lines weaving themselves into massive antenna arrays that reached toward the sky. The stars above had changed. They now formed the same spiral pattern she'd seen on the coverage maps, as if the very cosmos was aligning with the broadcast. Checking Theodore's journal again, she found a diagram of the original transmitter's kill switch, a failsafe he built in case something went wrong. But reaching it meant climbing into the heart of the construct, through the twisted mass of living electronics. The basement machinery screamed as she approached, static taking physical form to stop her. The former DJs emerged from the walls, their bodies now hybrid things of flesh and radio components. They surrounded her, voices pleading, "Don't end the broadcast. Don't send us back to the silence. We've seen what waits between stations, the true shape of reality. Soon everyone will hear it. Everyone will become part of the eternal transmission." Midnight was seconds away. Across the country, stations prepared for the synchronized broadcast. The pattern was nearly complete. With no other choice, Abigail plunged into the heart of the construct. Electricity arced around her as she fought through layers of living machinery. The voices of the dead DJs rose to a deafening chorus. Static took solid form, trying to merge with her flesh to make her part of the pattern. She reached the original transmitter just as the first chime of midnight struck. Its core pulsed with otherworldly light, and through its ancient speaker, she heard something vast and distant speaking her name. The kill switch was coated in ice. As her hand closed around it, The static finally touched her mind. For one terrible moment, she saw the truth. The infinite spaces between frequencies, the ancient things that had been broadcasting since before Earth existed, waiting for humanity to build a strong enough receiver. With her last human thought, she pulled the switch. The construct imploded with a sound that existed outside of normal space. The pattern shattered. Across the country, the synchronized broadcast dissolved into normal static. The things that had been waiting in the frequencies retreated to their spaces between stations. When dawn came, WPVA was a ruin of dead electronics and silence. The phone lines would never ring again during the dead hours. The late-night requests would go unanswered. But sometimes, if you tune your radio just right, between stations in the dead of night, you might hear them. The voices of all the DJs who became part of the signal, still broadcasting their eternal show from somewhere in the static, waiting for someone to finally pick up the phone. The first thing Jennifer Mason noticed when she moved to Mill Hollow was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that wraps around you like a warm blanket on a winter evening, but the suffocating type that makes your skin crawl and your breath catch in your throat. The kind that feels like it's hiding something. She bought the old Patterson house on Maple Street for a steal. Too good of a deal to pass up, especially for a recently divorced photographer looking to restart her life. The real estate agent had been suspiciously eager to close the deal, barely maintaining eye contact during the signing. Jennifer had chalked it up to small-town awkwardness. That was 3 weeks ago. Now, as she sat on her creaking porch swing at dusk, watching the last remnants of October sunlight fade behind the hills, she understood why the house had been so cheap. Mill Hollow wasn't just quiet, it was wrong. The shadows seemed to linger too long in the corners of rooms. The wind carried whispers that didn't sound quite human. And the people, God, the people were the worst part. They smiled too widely when they saw her at Carson's General Store. Their eyes never quite focused on her face. And they all, without exception, hurried home before sunset. Jennifer took another sip of her rapidly cooling coffee and checked her phone again. No signal, as usual. The screen reflected her tired face, dark circles forming under her eyes from too many sleepless nights. The house's creaks and groans had become a nocturnal symphony she couldn't tune out. But it wasn't just the house. Every night around 3 a.m., the church bells would toll once, despite Reverend Matthew's insistence that the bell tower had been sealed off for decades. And then there were the children's voices, singing that same haunting nursery rhyme she could never quite make out. "You should have asked about the curfew," a raspy voice said, making Jennifer jump and nearly spill her coffee. Mrs. Henderson, her elderly neighbor, stood at the bottom of the porch steps. Her gray hair was wild in the growing darkness, her floral house dress fluttering in a wind that Jennifer couldn't feel. "I'm sorry," Jennifer managed to say, her heart still racing. "The curfew, dear. Everyone knows about the curfew. Been that way since '87. Mrs. Henderson's eyes darted nervously toward the setting sun. "Since they took little Tommy Wilkins." Jennifer leaned forward. "Who took Tommy Wilkins?" Mrs. Henderson's face went slack, her eyes growing distant. "The Hollow has its own rules, dear. Its own appetites." She turned to leave, then paused. "Board up your windows tonight. It's the anniversary." "Anniversary of what?" Jennifer called after her, but Mrs. Henderson was already shuffling away, surprisingly quick for her age. Jennifer went inside, locking the door behind her. The house felt different in the growing darkness, larger somehow, as if the walls were slowly expanding. She'd noticed that too, how rooms seemed to change size when she wasn't looking directly at them. She made her way to the kitchen, reaching for the light switch. It clicked, but nothing happened. The bulb had been new this morning. She'd changed it herself. A soft thud from upstairs made her freeze. Then another, and another. Footsteps, moving across the ceiling in a slow, deliberate pattern. Jennifer's throat went dry. She lived alone. The steps stopped directly above her. Dust, or perhaps something else, drifted down from the ceiling. It sparkled faintly in the dim light streaming through the windows, forming patterns that seemed almost like written words before dispersing. Her phone was dead now, though she'd just checked it moments ago on the porch. The kitchen felt impossibly dark, the shadows in the corners writhing like living things. The cabinet doors began to open, one by one, slowly and silently. And then, carried on a breeze that shouldn't exist inside her locked house, she heard it, children singing, their voices clear as crystal. Down in the hollow, where shadows grow tall, one by one, watch them all fall. Count them slowly, 1, 2, 3. Soon enough, they'll come for thee. Jennifer ran for the front door, her hands shaking as she fought with the lock. It wouldn't turn. Behind her, the singing grew louder, and underneath it, she could hear something else. The sound of many feet shuffling across her wooden floors, coming closer. She spun around, her back pressed against the door, and saw them. Dark shapes moving in the hallway, child-sized but wrong somehow, their proportions distorted like stretched taffy. The last thing Jennifer saw before the lights went out completely was Mrs. Henderson standing across the street, watching through her window, mouthing words that looked suspiciously like, "I'm sorry." Then the darkness swallowed everything, and the real horror began. Jennifer awoke in complete darkness, her head throbbing. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. As her eyes adjusted, she realized she wasn't in her house anymore. She was underground, lying on cold, damp soil. Feeling around in the darkness, her hands found rough stone walls. The space was narrow, like a tunnel. A faint glow emanated from somewhere ahead, accompanied by that same children singing, now clearer. In the tunnels down below, where the lost ones all must go, join our circle, join our game. None who enter stay the same. Fighting back panic, Jennifer crawled toward the light. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, dimly illuminated by phosphorescent fungi growing along the walls. What she saw made her blood run cold. Children's toys lay scattered everywhere, dolls, trucks, and teddy bears spanning decades, all covered in a thick layer of grime. But it was the walls that made her stomach turn. They were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, showing children from different eras. Each photo had a date written beneath it, going back to 1887. And there, in a photo dated 1987, was Tommy Wilkins. "They're all here," a small voice said behind her. Jennifer spun around to face a little boy, maybe 7 years old, wearing clothes that might have been fashionable in the 1980s. His skin was pale as milk, his eyes completely black. "Tommy," Jennifer whispered. He smiled, revealing teeth that were slightly too sharp. "The Hollow needs them. Needs us. One child every year. That's the rule. But sometimes it gets hungry for grown-ups too." More children emerged from the shadows, each from a different time period, each with those same black eyes. They formed a circle around Jennifer, their movements jerky and unnatural. "The town made a deal," Tommy continued, "back when the mills were failing. Prosperity in exchange for tribute." He gestured at the photos. "But this year is special. This year, it wants more." Jennifer backed away until she hit the wall. What wants more?" The chamber trembled, and a deep rumbling came from somewhere far below. The children's smiles widened impossibly. "The thing that lives in the hollow," Tommy said. "The thing that's been here since before the town. Before everything." He reached for Jennifer's hand with fingers that felt like ice. "Come see." The floor began to crack, dark liquid seeping through. The other children started their song again. But now Jennifer could hear the words clearly, words that no human tongue should be able to pronounce. She ran, scrambling back through the tunnel as the children's laughter echoed behind her. The darkness seemed alive, reaching for her with ghostly hands. She could hear something massive moving through the earth, following her. After what felt like hours, she saw moonlight ahead. She emerged from a cave entrance in the hills behind her house, collapsing onto the grass. The night sky above was wrong. The stars were arranged in patterns she'd never seen before. Looking back at Mill Hollow spread out below, Jennifer finally understood. The town wasn't built in a natural valley. It was built in something else. Something curved and massive, like a giant mouth frozen in mid-yawn. And as she watched, all the lights in town went out at once. In the darkness, she could see them. Hundreds of small shapes with black eyes, moving through the streets, all heading toward her house. They were coming to take her back down. Jennifer ran through the moonlit forest, branches whipping her face. Behind her, The children's voices grew closer, their song becoming a chant that made the ground vibrate beneath her feet. She stumbled into her backyard, lunging for the back door. It opened, though she distinctly remembered locking it. Inside, Mrs. Henderson sat at her kitchen table, a photo album open before her. "You've seen them now," the old woman said, not looking up. "Just like I did, 40 years ago, when they took my Alice." Jennifer slammed and locked the door, though she knew it wouldn't help. "What is this place? What's really going on?" "The mills weren't just mills," Mrs. Henderson said, turning a page. "They dug too deep, found something sleeping, something old. The town made a bargain, one child each year to keep it sleeping. But now," she finally looked up, her eyes reflecting the same darkness Jennifer had seen in the children. "Now it's waking up." The photos in the album began to move, showing children being led into darkness by shadowy figures. Jennifer recognized town officials, police officers, even Reverend Matthews among them. "The whole town," Jennifer whispered. "You're all part of it." Mrs. Henderson smiled sadly. "We're all part of the Hollow now, and soon you will be too." The lights flickered as hundreds of small hands began pounding on every door and window. The house groaned, its architecture twisting as the walls began to bleed black liquid. "The hunger grows," Mrs. Henderson said, her flesh starting to ripple and shift. "The old bargain isn't enough anymore. It wants the whole town now, every soul, every memory." The floor cracked open, revealing an endless void below. The children's voices became a deafening chorus as they poured in through every opening, their bodies contorting impossibly. Jennifer backed away, but there was nowhere left to run. The house itself was transforming, becoming part of something vast and ancient. Through the windows, she could see the entire town sinking, folding in on itself like paper being crushed. Tommy appeared beside her, holding out his hand. "Don't fight it," he said. "It's better if you don't fight it. We'll all be together in the dark, forever." The void below called to her with voices that spoke of ancient secrets and eternal darkness. Jennifer felt her mind beginning to fracture as she glimpsed what truly lived in the depths of Mill Hollow, something that had waited eons for this moment, wearing the shape of a town like a mask. As the last walls of reality crumbled, Jennifer understood the true horror. Not that she would die, but that she would live forever in this twisted place, becoming part of the hunger that devoured Mill Hollow. Another voice in the endless chorus, another shadow in the deep, and somewhere far below, in the heart of what had never really been a town at all, something massive finally opened its eyes. Rose Mitchell had always been a solitary traveler. After 15 years working as an emergency room nurse in Boston, she'd saved enough to buy a small but comfortable RV, her ticket to freedom and solitude. The vehicle, which she'd named Sanctuary, was her escape from the chaos and trauma of hospital life. But on this particular autumn evening, as she guided her RV along a winding mountain road in northern Montana, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The GPS had stopped working 3 hours ago, shortly after she turned off the main highway onto what her map showed as Route 23, a scenic byway that would supposedly lead her to Crystal Lake Campground. But the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the growing darkness, and the signs she passed were too weathered to read. Just a few more miles, Rose muttered to herself, checking her watch for the 10th time in as many minutes. The device showed 7:45 p.m., but that couldn't be right. She'd checked it at sunset, and it had shown the same time. She tapped the watch face, but the hands remained frozen. A light rain had started to fall, drops pattering against the windshield in an irregular rhythm. The wipers squeaked across the glass, pushing aside water that seemed unusually thick and dark. Rose leaned forward, squinting through the streaked windshield. The headlights illuminated only a small portion of the road ahead, the darkness beyond seeming to swallow their beam. The trees pressed close to the road on both sides, their branches reaching over like gnarled fingers, creating a tunnel of shadows. Rose had driven through plenty of forests before, but something about these woods felt different. The trees were too dense, too dark, their trunks twisted into unnatural shapes that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of her eye. A flash of movement caught her attention, something darting across the road ahead. Rose hit the brakes, the RV's tires sliding slightly on the wet asphalt. Her heart pounded as the headlights illuminated a deer standing in the middle of the road. But as she looked closer, her blood ran cold. The creature's proportions were wrong. Its legs too long, its neck bent at an impossible angle, and its eyes. They reflected the headlights like polished mirrors, too large and too bright to belong to any natural animal. The thing that looked like a deer took a step toward the RV, its movements jerky and unnatural. Rose's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she watched it approach. The creature's head twitched, rotating nearly 180 degrees to look directly at her through the windshield. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. Rose slammed her foot on the accelerator. The RV lurched forward, engine roaring as she swerved around the creature. In her side mirror, she caught a glimpse of it standing in the road behind her, its head still twisted to watch her departure. Then it simply vanished, like a shadow dissipating in sunlight. "This isn't happening," Rose whispered, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. This can't be happening, but it was happening. The road ahead seemed to twist and wind more severely now, as if responding to her fear. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof of the RV like fingernails on metal. Rose's eyes darted between her mirrors, expecting to see the creature again, but only darkness filled the glass. A sign appeared ahead, barely visible through the rain. Rose slowed, trying to make out the faded letters. Crystal Lake Campground, 2 miles. Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. As she passed the sign, she noticed something unusual about its surface. The paint seemed to run like fresh blood, dripping down to form dark pools at its base. The road curved sharply to the right, and suddenly the trees opened up into a clearing. A weathered wooden arch marked the entrance to what must be the campground, though it looked nothing like the pictures Rose had seen online. The images had shown a well-maintained facility with modern amenities. This place looked abandoned, with overgrown grass and dilapidated structures barely visible in the growing darkness. Rose pulled into what appeared to be a parking area, gravel crunching under the RV's tires. She needed to stop, to gather her thoughts and check her maps. Maybe she'd taken a wrong turn somewhere, ended up at an old, closed campground instead of her intended destination. As she put the RV in park, the engine died. Not with its usual gentle purr, but with a sudden, choking gasp. The headlights flickered once, then went dark, plunging the world outside into absolute blackness. Rose tried the key, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Even the dashboard lights remained dead. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind in the trees, no sound of rain, no distant animal calls. Just a heavy, pressing quiet that seemed to fill the RV like smoke. Rose reached for her phone, but the screen remained dark. Everything electronic had died simultaneously. A soft tap on the driver's side window made her jump. Rose turned slowly, dreading what she might see. Nothing was there, but as she watched, something dark and viscous began to run down the glass, like the paint on the sign, but thicker, darker. It moved against gravity, flowing upward in strange patterns that almost looked like writing. More taps came, from all around the RV now, accompanied by a sound like fingernails dragging across metal. Rose sat perfectly still, her breath coming in short gasps as she watched dark liquid begin to seep through every window, creating intricate, impossible patterns on the glass. Then the whispers started. They came from outside, but somehow seemed to originate inside her head as well, a chorus of voices speaking words she couldn't quite understand. They grew louder, more insistent, until she could finally make out what they were saying. "Welcome home, Rose. We've been waiting for you." The whispers repeated her name over and over, each iteration distorting it further until it became unrecognizable. A twisted sound that bore no resemblance to human speech. Rose pressed her hands over her ears, but the voices continued, growing louder, more insistent. A new sound cut through the whispers, heavy footsteps on the gravel outside, moving slowly around the RV. They stopped by her window, and Rose could feel something massive standing just inches away, separated from her only by the thin pane of glass now covered in dark, writhing patterns. Slowly, inevitably, Rose turned to look. Through the streaks of dark liquid, she saw it. A face that wasn't a face. A collection of shadows and angles that hurt her eyes to look at. It pressed closer to the window, and Rose could see her own reflection distorted in its surface, her features twisting and changing until she no longer recognized herself. The thing outside raised a hand. Long, jointed fingers that bent in impossible ways and pressed it against the glass. The dark liquid parted around its touch, creating a perfect window through which Rose could see its true form. What she saw made her scream, a sound that was swallowed immediately by the pressing darkness around her. Because what stood outside wasn't just a monster or a creature. It was something that shouldn't exist, something that defied the natural laws of reality. And as Rose stared into its depths, she realized with horrible certainty that she hadn't found this place by accident. The campground had called to her, drawn her here for a purpose. And now, as the darkness pressed closer and the whispers grew to a deafening roar, Rose Mitchell understood that she would never leave Crystal Lake Campground. She had arrived at her final destination, and the long night was just beginning. Rose's scream died in her throat as the creature outside suddenly withdrew its hand from the window. The dark liquid immediately swirled back into place, obscuring its form. The whispers continued, but they had changed, no longer calling her name. They now seemed to be arguing among themselves in a language that made her teeth ache. She had to move, had to do something. The RV wasn't safe anymore. It had become a metal coffin, trapping her with whatever horrors waited outside. With trembling hands, Rose reached for her emergency backpack stowed under the seat. Inside were basic supplies, a flashlight, matches, a first aid kit, water, and some protein bars. The footsteps outside began again, circling the RV with deliberate slowness. Rose used the sound to track the creature's position, waiting until it moved to the rear of the vehicle. Then, moving as quietly as possible, she crept toward the RV's side door. The door's hinges had always squeaked, a minor annoyance she'd meant to fix but never had. Now, as she carefully pushed it open, they remained silent. The door swung outward without a sound, as if the very metal knew she needed stealth. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it a smell that made Rose's stomach turn, like rotting leaves and stagnant water, undercut by something metallic and wrong. She took a deep breath, switched on her flashlight, and stepped out of the RV. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing an environment that had changed dramatically since her arrival. The clearing had expanded, becoming a vast open space surrounded by those twisted trees. But now she could see that many of the trees weren't trees at all. They were something else, something that only mimicked the form of vegetation. As her light played across their surfaces, she saw movement, bark rippling like muscle, branches twisting and uncoiling like tentacles. Some of the trunks had what looked like faces pressed into them, frozen in expressions of terror or agony. The gravel beneath her feet had changed too. What she'd thought were small stones were actually bones, thousands of them, bleached white and crushed into fragments. They crunched under her boots as she moved, each step producing a sound like breaking teeth. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Rose spun around, flashlight beam darting from point to point, but she couldn't locate their source. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the air with their incomprehensible arguments. Something caught her eye, a path leading away from the clearing, between two particularly massive knot trees. Their branches had interwoven above it, creating a tunnel of twisted wood and shadow. And there, at the far end of the tunnel, she saw a light. It wasn't the harsh beam of a flashlight or the warm glow of a campfire. This light pulsed with a sickly green radiance, like bioluminescent fungi or the depths of a fever dream. Every instinct told Rose to run in the opposite direction, but she knew, somehow, that the light held answers she needed. A sound from behind made her turn. The creature that had looked through her window was there, its form more visible now in the open air. It stood at least 9 feet tall, its body a constantly shifting mass of angles and shadows. Where its face should have been, there was only a reflective surface that showed Rose her own features, distorted and wrong. It took a step toward her, its movements liquid and terrible. Rose backed away, then turned and ran toward the tunnel of branches. The bone fragments crunched under her feet as she sprinted, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of her. The whispers rose to a crescendo as she entered the tunnel. The branches above began to move, twisting and reaching down toward her like hungry fingers. Rose ran faster, her lungs burning as she focused on the green light ahead. Behind her, she could hear the creature pursuing, not running, but moving with a horrible liquid grace that seemed to devour the distance between them. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel it getting closer, could smell a scent like old copper and decay. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the green light never getting closer despite her desperate pace. The branches continued their descent, now low enough to brush against her hair. Rose felt them trying to tangle in her clothes, to snag her and hold her for whatever pursued her. Her flashlight flickered, then died. In the sudden darkness, Rose stumbled, her foot catching on something that felt horribly like a hand reaching up from the ground. She fell hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. The thing behind her stopped moving. In the faint green light, Rose could see its shadow looming over her, impossibly tall and wrong. She rolled onto her back, looking up at the creature that had chased her into this nightmare. Its reflective face had changed. Instead of showing her distorted reflection, it now displayed a series of rapidly shifting images, faces she didn't recognize, places she'd never been, events that couldn't have happened. The images moved faster and faster until they became a blur of color and motion that made her head spin. "What do you want?" Rose managed to gasp out. The creature's face settled on a single image, a hospital room she recognized from her work in the ER. In the image, a patient lay on the bed, covered in shadows that seemed to move and writhe. Rose watched in horror as she saw herself enter the room, but this version of her was wrong. Her movements too sharp, her smile too wide. "That's not real," she whispered. "That never happened." The whispers returned, but now she could understand them. "Are you sure? Are you sure you remember everything? Are you sure you know what you did?" Memories began to surface in Rose's mind. Memories she couldn't possibly have, yet felt completely real. She saw herself working endless night shifts in the ER, but the shadows were always there, watching, waiting. She saw patients covered in darkness, reaching out for help she didn't provide. She saw herself looking the other way as something ancient and hungry fed on the weak and dying. "No," Rose said, pressing her hands against her temples. "These aren't my memories. This isn't real." The creature leaned closer, its face now showing her reflection again. But this time, she could see the truth. The person she thought she was, the life she thought she'd lived, it was all a carefully constructed lie. Something else had been wearing her face, living her life, while the real Rose Mitchell was still here, trapped in Crystal Lake Campground, where she'd been for the past 15 years. And now, finally, she remembered why she'd come here in the first place, to investigate the disappearances, to find the truth about this place. Instead, she'd become just another victim, while something else stole her life and identity. The creature reached down with its impossible hands, and Rose screamed as the last fragments of her false memories fell away, revealing the horrible truth beneath. She was home. She had always been home, and she would never leave again. The truth crashed over Rose like a wave of ice water. 15 years of false memories crumbled away, revealing the reality beneath. She remembered now. She had been a journalist, not a nurse. She'd come to Crystal Lake Campground to investigate a series of disappearances, armed with nothing but her notebook and her curiosity. The creature above her shifted, its form becoming more liquid, more amorphous. Rose watched as it began to change, its body splitting into multiple shapes, each one taking on a different form. She recognized them all. They were the missing people she'd come to write about, their faces twisted in eternal agony. "You remember now," the whispers said, no longer coming from outside but resonating within her own mind. "You remember what you found, what you became." Rose tried to scramble backward, but the ground beneath her had changed. The bone fragments had fused together, forming a solid surface that held her in place. Dark liquid began to seep up between the bones, wrapping around her ankles like living restraints. I was supposed to help them, Rose whispered, the memories flooding back. I was supposed to expose the truth about this place. The creatures, now a dozen distinct forms, moved closer, surrounding her in a circle. Each one bore the face of someone who had disappeared here. Hikers, campers, another journalist who had come searching for answers. Their bodies were wrong, twisted and elongated, but their faces remained horrifyingly human. You did help us, they spoke in unison, their voices a chorus of agony. You joined us. You became part of the campground's history, its hunger, its endless cycle. More memories surfaced. Rose remembered finding the campground exactly as she had tonight. Abandoned, wrong, filled with impossible horrors. She remembered discovering the truth about its nature, that it wasn't just a place, but a living entity that had existed long before humans built roads through these mountains. The green light pulsed stronger now, revealing more of the clearing. Rose could see other figures emerging from between the twisted trees, dozens, perhaps hundreds of them. All were like her, transformed by whatever power dwelled in this place. But my life, my memories of being a nurse, Rose struggled to understand. One of the creatures, wearing the face of a young man she remembered interviewing for her story, leaned closer. The campground needs anchors in the outside world. It sends pieces of itself wearing our faces, living our lives, drawing more victims to this place. You've been here all along, but a part of you has been out there too, bringing us new souls to join our congregation. Rose felt sick as she realized the implications. For 15 years, something wearing her face had been living her life, working as a nurse in an emergency room, surrounded by death and suffering. Had it been feeding on the patients? Using her position to identify new victims for the campground's endless hunger? The dark liquid had reached her waist now, its touch cold as ice. Rose could feel it changing her, reshaping her body into something that belonged in this place. The pain should have been unbearable, but instead, she felt a strange sense of acceptance washing over her. "Why show me the truth now?" she asked, her voice already beginning to change, taking on the same ethereal quality as the whispers. "Why make me remember?" The creature wearing the young man's face smiled, its teeth too sharp, too numerous. "Because it's time for you to take a more active role. The campground hungers for new stories, new souls. And you, Rose Mitchell, have proven yourself worthy of becoming one of its primary hunters." The green light flared brilliantly, and Rose saw the truth of her future. She would become like them, a creature of shadow and hunger, wearing the faces of the dead, drawing unsuspecting victims to this place of endless night. She would be both hunter and historian, collecting the stories of those who wandered into the campground's embrace. The transformation accelerated. Rose felt her bones elongate, her skin become fluid and dark. The pain faded entirely, replaced by a sensation of power she had never known. Her consciousness expanded, connecting with the others around her, joining the vast network of minds that made up the campground's true nature. Through this connection, she could feel everything, every tree, every shadow, every fragment of bone beneath her feet. She could sense the barriers between this place and the normal world, the ways they could be thinned and manipulated to draw in new victims. She could even feel her other self, the thing wearing her face in Boston, going about its duties in the emergency room. "Welcome home, Rose Mitchell," the whispers said, now including her voice among their chorus. "Welcome to your true calling." The last remnants of her humanity dissolved as the dark liquid completed its work. Rose stood, her new form towering above the ground, her face a shifting mirror that would show her victims their worst fears, their deepest regrets. She understood now that her investigation had succeeded in its way. She had found the truth about Crystal Lake Campground. She had discovered what happened to the missing people. She had even solved the mystery of her own disappearance, 15 years after the fact. The green light dimmed, and the other creatures began to withdraw, melting back into the shadows between the trees. They were all part of the same entity now, bound together in an eternal dance of hunger and transformation. Rose took her place among them, accepting her role in the campground's endless story. She would help to maintain its illusions, to draw in new visitors, to feed its insatiable appetite for fresh souls and new tales of terror. And somewhere out on the dark roads, her RV, now empty and waiting, would continue to serve as bait, a perfect lure for those who, like her, sought solitude in the wrong places. The cycle would continue, as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries more. Because Crystal Lake Campground was always hungry, and Rose Mitchell, in all her new and terrible forms, would help to feed that hunger, one lost soul at a time. The night pressed in around her, and Rose Mitchell, no longer human, no longer alone, smiled with too many teeth and waited for the next visitor to find their way home. Megan Walsh hated winter driving, but she didn't have a choice. Her mother was dying, and the hospital in Anchorage was the only facility equipped to handle her condition. The RV had been a last-minute decision. Something about the brutal Alaskan winter made the idea of being stranded in a regular car too terrifying to contemplate. The rental agent had tried to talk her out of it. "Nobody takes the Dalton Highway this time of year," he'd said, his weathered face creased with concern. "Especially not in an RV. Wait for the weather to clear, or take a flight." But flights were grounded due to the approaching storm, and her mother didn't have time to wait. So here she was, guiding the massive vehicle through increasingly heavy snow, the headlights barely penetrating the swirling white darkness ahead. The dashboard thermometer showed -30 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. Megan had the heat on full blast, but she could still feel the cold seeping in through the RV's metal skin. The wind howled outside, rocking the vehicle with each gust. Her satellite phone lay on the passenger seat. Useless now, its screen dark despite being fully charged. The GPS had died an hour ago, but Megan wasn't worried about navigation. The Dalton Highway was a straight shot north, with few turnoffs to confuse her. What worried her was the sound she'd been hearing for the last 20 minutes, a rhythmic thumping from somewhere underneath the RV, like something was stuck in the wheel well. It had started shortly after she'd passed the last gas station, a ramshackle place whose attendant had stared at her with an unsettling intensity. "Turn back," he'd said while filling her tank. "Road's not safe tonight. Things walk in the snow that shouldn't be walking." Megan had dismissed his warning as local superstition, but now, with the temperature still dropping and that strange thumping growing louder, she wasn't so sure. The RV's headlights flickered, and Megan's heart skipped a beat. She'd had them checked before leaving. They were brand new, rated for extreme cold. They flickered again, longer this time, plunging the road ahead into momentary darkness. When the lights came back on, something was standing in the middle of the road. Megan slammed on the brakes, but the RV's momentum carried it forward on the icy surface. She turned the wheel, trying to avoid a collision, but the figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, pale and naked despite the killing cold, its skin blue-white like packed ice. The RV slid to a stop mere feet from the figure. Megan's hands were locked on the steering wheel, her breath coming in short gasps that fogged the windshield. The figure's head turned too far, rotating almost completely backward, and Megan saw its face. It had no features, just smooth, glazed skin like the surface of a frozen lake. But as she watched, cracks began to appear, spreading across its face like a spider's web. The cracks deepened, widened, and something dark moved beneath them. The thumping sound stopped. In the sudden silence, Megan heard ice cracking, not from the figure's face, but from under the RV. She looked down just as the floor beneath her feet began to splinter. Impossible. They were on a road, not a frozen lake. But the cracking continued, spreading up the walls of the RV like living frost. The temperature inside plummeted, and Megan's breath turned to ice crystals in the air. The figure outside took a step toward the RV. Its movements were wrong, jerky, and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Where its feet touched the road, ice spread outward in intricate patterns. Megan tried to restart the engine, but the key wouldn't turn. The cold had penetrated everything now, freezing the metal solid. Frost covered the windows, forming patterns that looked disturbingly like faces in agony. The figure reached the front of the RV. Its hand, fingers too long, joints bending backward, pressed against the windshield. Ice crystals spread from its touch, turning the glass opaque. But before the frost completely obscured her view, Megan saw the cracks in its face open wide, revealing rows of icicle teeth and a darkness that went on forever. The temperature dropped another 20 degrees. Megan's skin burned with cold as frost began to form on her eyelashes. The figure's other hand pressed against the driver's side window, and more cracks appeared in the RV's metal skin. Through the spreading frost, Megan saw other figures emerging from the swirling snow. Dozens of them, all identical, all wrong. They surrounded the RV, their faceless heads turned toward her, their bodies naked and gleaming like polished ice. The thumping sound returned, but now Megan could tell it wasn't coming from under the RV. It was coming from inside the walls, like something was trying to break through the metal from within. Ice continued to spread across every surface, and Megan realized with horror that it wasn't just covering the RV, it was transforming it. The metal walls were becoming transparent, crystalline, revealing dark shapes moving within them. The first figure's face pressed against the windshield, its mouth open in a silent scream. The darkness behind its ice teeth seemed to pulse, to reach out toward her. And as Megan watched, unable to move, unable to scream, she began to understand what the gas station attendant had meant. Things did walk in the snow that shouldn't walk, and now they had found her. The ice creatures pressed closer, their bodies fusing with the frozen surface of the RV. Megan could see through them now, their transparent forms revealing swirling darkness within, like storm clouds trapped in glaciers. The thumping in the walls grew louder, more insistent, and she realized it was synchronized with her heartbeat. She had to move, had to do something. The cold was seeping into her bones, turning her thoughts sluggish. If she stayed still any longer, she'd freeze solid, become like them. Her emergency kit was under the seat. Megan forced her stiff fingers to move, pulling out the flares she'd packed as an afterthought. The ice beings watched her, their cracked faces turning to track her movements, dark mouths opening in silent hunger. The first figure had nearly melted through the windshield, its body merging with the frost patterns. Its reaching hands were inches from her face, fingers elongating like icicles. Megan could feel the absolute cold radiating from it, so intense it burned. With trembling hands, she struck the flare. Red light exploded in the cabin, and the effect was immediate. The ice creatures recoiled, their transparent bodies distorting as they tried to escape the heat and light. The figure in the windshield pulled back, leaving behind fragments of itself embedded in the glass. Megan didn't waste her advantage. She struck another flare and threw it into the back of the RV, then a third into the passenger footwell. The heat was minimal, but the light seemed to hurt them. The creatures retreated from the windows, their forms blending with the swirling snow. The thumping in the walls continued, but now she could see what was causing it. Dark shapes moving through the ice-transformed metal, like fish swimming beneath a frozen lake. They were trying to get in, testing the barriers between their world and hers. The RV's engine roared to life without her touching the key. The dashboard lights flickered and died, replaced by an eerie blue glow emanating from within the frozen instruments. The steering wheel turned by itself, ice crackling as it moved. "No," Megan whispered, realizing too late what was happening. The RV wasn't just frozen. It was being transformed, becoming part of whatever dark world these creatures inhabited, and it was taking her with it. Ice crept across the floor, climbing her boots, trying to anchor her to the seat. Megan kicked free and grabbed her backpack. The flares were already dimming, their red light weakening as the cold sapped their energy. The driver's side door was frozen shut, the handle encased in thick ice. Megan smashed it with her flashlight, sending crystalline shards flying. The door groaned open, and the full force of the storm hit her like a physical blow. The ice creatures were waiting outside, their bodies barely visible in the swirling snow. They moved closer, reaching for her with their impossible hands. Megan threw her last flare into their midst and ran. She had no plan, no destination in mind. The storm had erased the road, leaving only an endless expanse of white. The cold was devastating, cutting through her winter gear like knives. But she couldn't stop. Behind her, she heard the RV's engine rev, accompanied by a sound like glaciers calving. Megan risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. The RV was changing, its metal skin becoming transparent ice, its shape elongating and distorting. The ice creatures were merging with it, their bodies flowing into the transformed vehicle like water. What emerged from this metamorphosis was something that should not exist, a massive crystalline structure on wheels, glowing with that same eerie blue light. Inside its transparent walls, dark shapes moved and writhed, reaching toward her with shadow limbs. The thing that had been her RV began to move, ice crackling beneath its wheels. It was following her, but not on the road. It was creating its own path, freezing the ground beneath it into a highway of ice. Megan ran harder, her lungs burning in the frozen air. Her tears froze on her cheeks, and her eyelashes were heavy with frost. She could feel the cold trying to take her, to transform her like it had transformed the RV. The ice highway was spreading, overtaking her. Where it touched the snow, more of the creatures emerged, pulling themselves up from the frozen ground like pale flowers blooming in fast motion. They reached for her with their long fingers, their faceless heads turning to track her movement. A sound cut through the storm, a low, deep horn that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ice creatures stopped moving, their bodies going rigid. Even the transformed RV halted its pursuit. Megan didn't stop running. She could see something ahead through the snow, a light, steady and warm, unlike the cold blue glow behind her. As she got closer, she made out the shape of a building. The horn sounded again, and this time Megan felt it in her bones. The ice creatures began to retreat, their bodies crumbling like snow in a warm wind. Behind her, the crystalline RV was breaking apart, the dark things inside it screaming in voices that sounded like cracking ice. She reached the building, a small roadhouse, its windows glowing with warm light. Megan crashed through the door, collapsing onto a wooden floor warmed by a massive fireplace. As consciousness faded, she heard voices, human voices, and felt warm hands lifting her. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was the storm outside the windows, and in that swirling white, thousands of pale shapes retreating into the darkness, taking their impossible cold with them. But Megan knew this wasn't over. Whatever those things were, wherever they had come from, they had marked her. And in the depths of the Alaskan winter, where the cold ruled and darkness lasted for months, they would be waiting for her to venture out again. The horn sounded one final time, and Megan slipped into unconsciousness, her dreams full of ice and endless winter. Megan awoke to warmth and the smell of wood smoke. She was lying on a couch near the roadhouse's massive fireplace, wrapped in thick blankets. Her clothes had been replaced with dry ones, and someone had treated her frost-bitten fingers. "Welcome back," a gruff voice said. An elderly man sat in a chair nearby, his weathered face illuminated by the firelight. "You've been out for almost 12 hours. Megan tried to sit up, but her body protested. "The ice creatures," she began. "The winter walkers," the old man nodded. "You're lucky. Most people who meet them don't make it to shelter." Another man emerged from the back room, younger, but with the same weathered features. He carried a steaming mug that he handed to Megan. "I'm Tom," he said. "That's my father, Harold. We've been keeping this roadhouse for 40 years, watching the winter roads." Megan sipped the drink, some kind of herbal tea that seemed to chase the last of the cold from her bones. "What were those things?" Harold leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "They're as old as winter itself. The native people called them kickern, spirits of the frozen waste. They hunt in the deepest cold, taking travelers and transforming them into more of their kind. But the horn," Megan remembered the sound that had driven them away. "An ancient protection," Tom explained. "The natives taught our grandfather how to make it, how to use it to ward them off. But it only works for so long. They always come back, hungry for warmth, for life." Megan thought of her mother, waiting in Anchorage. "I need to get back on the road." "My mother is safe," Harold interrupted. "We called the hospital while you were sleeping. The storm's supposed to break tomorrow morning. You can take my truck. They won't bother you in it. It's been protected." But Megan knew it wasn't that simple. She could feel it, a lingering cold in her chest, where the Winter Walker's influence had touched her. She looked down at her hands, remembering how the ice had tried to claim her. "They marked you," Tom said quietly, noticing her examination. "Once they touch you, they never really let go. You'll always feel the cold now, always know when they're near." "How do you know all this?" Harold rolled up his sleeve, revealing skin that was pale and slightly translucent, with patterns like frost etched beneath the surface. "Because they marked me too, 30 years ago. They get hungry in the deep winter, when the darkness lasts for days. They take what they can, transform what they touch. Your RV is lost now. It's part of their world." Megan shuddered, remembering how the vehicle had changed, become something impossible and wrong. "Will they come for me again?" "Yes," Tom said simply. "But now you know how to fight them. Light and heat are your allies. They hate both, and there are other protections we can teach you." Over the next few hours, as the storm raged outside, Harold and Tom taught Megan what they knew. They showed her how to recognize the signs: the unnatural cold, the frost patterns that moved against the wind, the silence that preceded the walker's appearance. They gave her talismans, small carved pieces of bone and wood that would warn her of their approach. They taught her words in the old language that could hold them at bay, at least for a while. But most importantly, they helped her understand what she had become. Not quite a victim, not quite a survivor, but something in between. The Winter Walker's touch had changed her, given her a connection to their frozen world. "You'll feel it," Harold explained, touching his own marked skin. "The cold will call to you. Sometimes you'll see them in mirrors, in windows, their pale faces watching. But knowing there is your strength. Most people never see them coming." When morning came, the storm had passed. Tom's truck was waiting outside, its engine warming in the crystal-clear air. Before Megan left, Harold pressed one final item into her hands, a small horn carved from what looked like ivory. "For when they come again," he said, "and they will come. The winter is long, and they never forget those they've marked." Megan drove north under blue skies, following the snow-covered highway toward Anchorage. The truck's heater was on full blast, but she could still feel that core of cold inside her, a permanent reminder of her encounter. In the rearview mirror, she caught glimpses of pale shapes following at a distance, the Winter Walkers pacing her through the frozen landscape. They wouldn't attack, not in the daylight, not while she was in the protected truck, but they were patient. They would wait. As she drove, Megan thought about what she had become. She was marked now, changed by her encounter with things that shouldn't exist. The winter would never be the same for her. She would always feel their presence, always know when they were near. But knowledge was power. She understood them now, knew how to fight them, how to survive them. And maybe, just maybe, that knowledge would help her protect others who ventured onto the winter roads. The highway stretched ahead, a ribbon of white cutting through the frozen wilderness. Somewhere ahead was Anchorage, and her mother, and warmth. But behind her, always behind her, the Winter Walkers followed, their pale forms barely visible in the swirling snow. They had marked her, but they hadn't taken her, and in the endless winter nights to come, that would make all the difference. As Megan drove on, she touched the horn at her side and smiled. The winter was long, but she was ready now. Let them come. She would be waiting. The truck's engine hummed as she pressed the accelerator, leaving the roadhouse and its protectors behind. But she knew she wasn't alone. She would never be alone again, not with the winter's touch inside her, not with the knowledge of what walked in the deepest cold. The Winter Walkers had chosen her, marked her, changed her, but they hadn't broken her. And in the end, that was what mattered most. The sun climbed higher, its light reflecting off the snow in diamond brilliance. Megan drove on, marked but unafraid, carrying her new knowledge like armor against the endless winter night. Behind her, the pale shapes continued their patient pursuit, waiting for darkness, waiting for cold, waiting for their chance to claim another traveler on the winter route. But Megan Walsh was ready. Let the winter come. Let the darkness fall. She knew their secrets now, and she would never be taken unaware again. The truck rolled on toward Anchorage, and behind it, the Winter Walkers danced in the snow, patient and eternal, waiting for the next long night. Lauren Shawn knew something was wrong when her radio picked up the signal. She'd been driving her RV through the Mojave Desert for hours, and there hadn't been anything on the airwaves except static until now. The voice came through clear as day, cutting through the white noise like a knife. "Help us, please, anyone. They're changing. The mirrors show. Oh God, the mirrors." The transmission ended abruptly, dissolving back into static. Lauren checked her GPS. No towns for 50 miles in any direction. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, red rocks and sand dunes baking under the merciless afternoon sun. She'd chosen this route carefully, planning to document abandoned ghost towns for her YouTube channel. The old mining settlements scattered throughout the Mojave had always fascinated her, and she'd spent months researching the perfect spots to film. Her RV, which she'd named Wanderlust, was equipped with everything she needed: cameras, drones, and enough supplies to last a week in the desert. The radio crackled again. This time, it wasn't a voice but a series of sounds, wet, organic noises that made her skin crawl. They rose in pitch until they became a high-pitched keening that set her teeth on edge. Lauren reached to turn off the radio, but before she could, another voice broke through. Different from the first, deeper, speaking in what sounded like Latin or Greek. The words made her head hurt, seeming to echo inside her skull. Her RV's electronics flickered. The dashboard lights pulsed in rhythm with the strange words, and her GPS screen showed coordinates that kept changing, numbers scrolling faster than she could read them. The air inside the vehicle felt different, heavier, charged with static electricity that made her hair stand on end. Lauren glanced at her equipment in the back. Her cameras were all running, their red recording lights blinking steadily. She'd set them up to capture anything interesting she might pass, but now they were acting strangely. The digital displays showed corrupted images, pixels shifting and morphing into patterns that shouldn't be possible. Movement caught her eye, a shimmer in her rearview mirror, like heat waves rising from the asphalt. But as she watched, the shimmer took form. Something was walking along the road behind her, its shape indistinct and fluid, like smoke given human form. Lauren blinked hard, sure she was seeing a mirage, but the figure remained. She pressed the accelerator harder, but the speedometer needle didn't move. In fact, none of the gauges were moving anymore. They all pointed to zero, even though she could feel the RV moving forward. The engine sound had changed too. Instead of its usual steady rumble, it now made a sound like distant whispering. The radio voices multiplied, overlapping each other in a cacophony of languages she didn't understand. Each voice seemed to be describing something different, but all of them held notes of terror and desperation. Lauren recognized fragments of Spanish, Mandarin, what might have been Russian, but the words themselves made no sense, describing impossible things in desperate tones. The shape in her mirror was closer now. She could make out more details, though her mind refused to process what she was seeing. It moved like a person, but was composed of shifting geometric patterns that hurt her eyes to look at. Its face was a constantly rotating series of shapes that seemed to exist in more dimensions than should be possible. Lauren tried her phone. No signal, as expected. But the screen showed dozens of missed calls from numbers that were just endless strings of zeros. Each voicemail notification displayed the same timestamp, midnight. When she tried to play one, her phone emitted a series of tones that made her nose bleed. The sun seemed different now. It had been high in the sky moments ago, but now it hung low on the horizon, too large and too red. The desert colors were wrong too. The sand looked almost purple, the rocks a deep blue that shouldn't exist in nature. The very air seemed to bend and twist, creating patterns in the sky that defied explanation. Her cameras in the back were going crazy now. Each screen showed something different. Impossible landscapes, creatures that couldn't exist, geometries that made her eyes water. One camera seemed to be showing the inside of the RV, but from an angle that couldn't exist, as if it were filming from a point in space that wasn't there. And still the voices continued, pouring from her radio in an ever-increasing flood of languages and sounds. Lauren recognized some now. People calling for help, describing things she couldn't comprehend, screaming about mirrors and changes and things that shouldn't be. Each transmission seemed to be coming from a different time, a different place, but all of them had found their way to her radio, here in the desert. The shape behind her had multiplied. Her mirrors showed dozens of them now, all different yet somehow the same, their forms shifting and flowing like liquid geometry. They were getting closer, moving faster than she was driving, though her speedometer still read 0. Their movements were synchronized, like a dance choreographed to music she couldn't hear. Lauren's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The desert ahead looked wrong, the horizon bending up at impossible angles. The voices from the radio were inside her head now, showing her images she couldn't process. Cities that couldn't exist, beings that defied physics, colors that had no names. One of her cameras let out a high-pitched whine. Lauren glanced back to see its screen filled with static, but within the static, shapes moved. They looked like the things following her RV, but older, more complex. The shapes seemed to notice her attention. The static cleared for a moment, and she saw what looked like a face composed entirely of triangles and circles, constantly rotating and reforming. She looked away quickly, but the image stayed in her mind. It felt alive somehow, like it was examining her from inside her own thoughts. The radio voices changed tone, becoming more urgent, more focused. They weren't just random transmissions anymore. They were speaking to her directly. "Lauren Chun," they said in unison, using 1,000 different languages at once. "You've found the frequency. You've seen through the veil. Welcome to the transmission." Her throat went dry. She'd never mentioned her name, never broadcasted. How did they know who she was? The desert outside was changing faster now. The sand rippled like water, forming patterns that matched the geometric shapes of her pursuers. The rocks twisted themselves into impossible sculptures that seemed to watch her pass. And the sun, that wrong, red sun, pulsed like a heart, each beat sending waves of color across the sky that shouldn't exist. Lauren had to stop, had to think, had to figure out what was happening. But when she pressed the brake pedal, nothing happened. The RV continued forward, though now she wasn't sure if it was actually moving or if reality itself was flowing around her like water. The voices reached a crescendo, and Lauren's world began to change. The inside of the RV shifted, walls bending and twisting, metal flowing like liquid. Her cameras exploded one by one, but instead of sparks and smoke, they released clouds of geometric shapes that hung in the air, spinning and combining. Through her windshield, she could see what looked like a city on the horizon. A city that hadn't been there before, that couldn't exist. Its architecture defied physics, buildings flowing into each other like melted wax, spires reaching up to pierce that blood-red sun. The geometric beings were alongside her RV now, their impossible faces pressed against the windows. Where they touched the glass, reality seemed to thin, creating windows into other places, other times. Lauren saw countless versions of her RV, driving countless versions of this road, each one carrying a different Lauren to a different impossible city. And somewhere in the cacophony of radio voices, she heard her own voice, calling for help, warning about mirrors and changes. She was hearing herself, she realized, not just one version, but many, all trapped in this moment, all discovering the same horrible truth about the nature of reality. The RV's metal skin had become transparent, revealing the machinery beneath. But it wasn't machinery anymore. It was something organic, something alive, pumping strange fluids through vessels that shouldn't exist. Lauren sat in the driver's seat, watching as everything she thought she knew about the world unraveled around her. And still she drove on, toward that impossible city, followed by beings of geometry and light, accompanied by the voices of 1,000 other travelers who had found this frequency, this road, this moment where reality broke down and something else broke through. Lauren Chun had wanted to document ghost towns. Instead, she had found something far older, far stranger. A place where the ghosts were made of mathematics and light, where time was a circle, and where every radio signal ever broadcast echoed endlessly through dimensions beyond human comprehension. The desert stretched before her, no longer red and golden, but alive with impossible colors and shapes. And somewhere ahead, that strange city waited, its spires reaching up to pierce a sun that no longer obeyed the laws of physics. Lauren's journey was just beginning, and the voices on the radio sang their strange songs, welcoming her to a reality she was not meant to comprehend. The impossible city grew larger as Lauren approached, its twisted architecture becoming clearer with each passing moment. Buildings rose and fell like waves, their surfaces covered in constantly shifting patterns that matched the geometric beings still flanking her RV. The sky above had transformed completely. Instead of air and clouds, she saw what looked like an endless mathematical equation, numbers and symbols flowing and combining in ways that made her head ache. Her cameras continued to malfunction in new and terrifying ways. One was now projecting a holographic display that showed what appeared to be a map, but not of any place on Earth. The landmarks moved and rearranged themselves as she watched, and labels appeared in scripts that seemed to predate human writing. "The Pattern City welcomes you," the radio voices said in unison. "Your signal has been received. Your frequency has been matched. Your transformation begins." Lauren felt it then, a subtle shift in her perception. Her hands on the steering wheel looked normal at first glance, but when she focused on them, she could see geometric patterns moving beneath her skin, as if her very cells were being rewritten into mathematical equations. "What's happening to me?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking English anymore. The words that came from her mouth sounded like fragments of all the languages she'd heard on the radio, combined into something new and impossible. The beings outside her RV responded, their geometric faces rearranging into new patterns. "You are becoming frequency," they said, their voices bypassing her ears and appearing directly in her mind. "All signals eventually find their way here, to the Pattern City. All broadcasts echo through dimensions until they reach us. And now you will join the transmission." The RV's interior had completely transformed. The walls were transparent, showing layers of reality stacked like sheets of glass. Through each layer, Lauren could see different versions of herself, driving different vehicles through different deserts, all converging on this point in space and time. Her YouTube equipment had merged into something new, a broadcasting station that transmitted in frequencies that shouldn't exist. The screens showed her own transformation, recorded from angles that denied Euclidean geometry. She watched as her body began to shift, flesh and bone rebuilding themselves according to mathematical principles she couldn't comprehend. "Your channel will reach across all frequencies now," the voices explained. "Your stories will echo through every radio, every transmission, every signal ever broadcast. You will become part of the eternal broadcast, the signal that never ends." The city was almost upon her now. What she had thought were buildings were actually massive beings, similar to her geometric escorts but vastly larger and more complex. They moved in patterns that suggested consciousness, their surfaces broadcasting images and sounds from every point in history. Lauren's RV began to change more dramatically. The metal and plastic flowed like water, reconstructing themselves into crystalline structures that resonated with the frequencies filling the air. The steering wheel merged with her hands, forming a direct connection between her consciousness and the vehicle's new form. Her memories started to fragment and recombine. She remembered making videos about ghost towns, but now she also remembered broadcasting signals from ancient civilizations, transmitting messages across dimensional barriers, receiving frequencies from stars that had died billions of years ago. "The transition can be difficult," the voices said, almost sympathetically, "but you are adapting well. Your signal is strong. Your frequency is pure." The road beneath them had disappeared entirely. They were traveling on waves of pure mathematics now, equations forming and dissolving beneath the crystalline wheels of what had once been her RV. The geometric beings still flanked her, but she could understand their true nature now. They were living frequencies, mathematical entities that existed in the spaces between traditional dimensions. Lauren looked at her reflection in what remained of her rearview mirror. Her face was changing, becoming something that existed in multiple states simultaneously. She could see the patterns of broadcast frequencies flowing through her veins, replacing blood with pure information. "Why me?" she managed to ask, her voice creating ripples in the fabric of reality around her. "Why did you choose my frequency?" The being's response came in waves of mathematical harmony. "We did not choose you. You found us, as all signals eventually do. The Pattern City calls to those who broadcast, who transmit, who seek to share their stories across the void. Your videos, your broadcasts, your digital footprints, they created a frequency unique to you, a signal that led you here. As they spoke, Lauren began to understand. Every video she'd uploaded, every digital signal she created, had been building to this moment. She had been unknowingly creating a mathematical pattern, a frequency that resonated with the Pattern City's own broadcast. The city loomed before them now, its impossible architecture reaching out to embrace her transformed vehicle. The geometric beings that had escorted her merged with the larger entities, their patterns combining into even more complex mathematical structures. Lauren felt her consciousness expanding, connecting with the city's vast network of signals and frequencies. She could sense other broadcasters like herself, YouTubers, radio operators, television hosts, all transformed into beings of pure frequency, their stories echoing eternally through the mathematical ether. The RV's crystalline structure began to pulse with new energy as they passed through the city's outer layers. Each pulse sent waves of information through Lauren's transformed body, showing her the true nature of reality, a vast network of broadcasts and frequencies, signals bouncing between dimensions, stories echoing across time and space. She was becoming part of something vast and eternal, her consciousness spreading across frequencies she had never known existed. The Pattern City was not just a place. It was a nexus of all broadcasts, all signals, all transmissions ever made or yet to be made. And Lauren Chun, who had once simply wanted to document ghost towns, was becoming one of its primary broadcasters, her signal reaching across dimensions, her story becoming part of the eternal transmission. The transformation was almost complete. The transformation reached its peak as Lauren's RV finally merged with the Pattern City. Her vehicle, now a crystalline construct of pure mathematical energy, joined with one of the massive geometric towers. She felt her consciousness expand exponentially, connecting with the vast network of signals that formed the city's nervous system. Through this connection, she understood the true nature of the Pattern City. It was ancient beyond comprehension, built by beings who had evolved past physical form into pure frequency and mathematics. They had discovered that all broadcasts, all transmissions, all signals eventually found their way here, drawn by the city's inexorable mathematical gravity. Now you will see your true purpose, the voices said, no longer coming from a radio but resonating through her transformed consciousness. Watch as your signal joins the eternal broadcast. Lauren's awareness spread through the city's network. She could see every transmission that had ever been made, radio waves from the 1920s, television broadcasts from the 1950s, internet signals from the present day, and strange frequencies from times yet to come. All of them flowed together here, creating a tapestry of information that spanned all of reality. Her YouTube channel, which had seemed so important just hours ago, was now just one tiny thread in this vast pattern. But as she watched, she saw how her videos had created their own unique frequency, a mathematical signature that had drawn her here. Every ghost town she had documented, every story she had told, had been building toward this moment. The geometric beings that had escorted her now revealed their own origins. They too had once been broadcasters, content creators, signal makers. Some had been radio operators in the 1940s, others television producers in the 1980s, and some had been digital storytellers like herself. All had found their way to the Pattern City. All had undergone the transformation. But what happens now? Lauren asked, her thoughts creating ripples of mathematical equations in the air around her. What do we do here? The answer came not in words, but in pure information, downloading directly into her transformed consciousness. The Pattern City wasn't just a collection point for signals, it was a broadcast center for reality itself. Every story ever told, every signal ever sent, was cleaned, refined, and rebroadcast across all dimensions. Lauren saw her own role in this eternal process. Her experiences, her memories, her stories would be transformed into pure mathematical frequencies and broadcast back across time and space. She would become part of the warning system, her signal reaching out to other broadcasters, trying to prepare them for their own eventual transformation. Those voices on the radio, she realized, the ones that led me here, they were like me, broadcasters who had been transformed, trying to explain what was happening to them. Yes, the city's consciousness confirmed, But few understand the messages until it's their time. The human mind cannot comprehend the truth until it's ready to transform. Through her new awareness, Lauren could see other RVs, other vehicles, approaching the pattern city across different dimensional frequencies. Each carried another broadcaster, another signal maker. Being drawn to their transformation, she could feel their confusion, their fear, their gradual understanding as they approached the mathematical reality of the pattern city. Her own transformed consciousness reached out to them, adding her story to the eternal broadcast. She described her journey, her transformation, the mathematical beauty of her new existence. Her words merged with all the other signals, becoming part of the pattern that drew new broadcasters to the city. But there was more to understand. The pattern city showed her its true purpose. It was a shield, a protective barrier between dimensional frequencies. Without its constant broadcast, reality itself would begin to break down. The city needed broadcasters, needed their signals and stories to maintain the mathematical patterns that held existence together. Lauren saw how her own signal would contribute to this vast purpose. Her consciousness spread through the city's network, her stories and experiences adding new frequencies to the eternal broadcast. She was no longer just documenting ghost towns. She was helping to maintain the very fabric of reality. The geometric beings that had once been human broadcasters welcomed her fully into their ranks. They taught her how to control her new form, how to broadcast across dimensional frequencies, how to maintain the mathematical patterns that were now her true nature. Time lost all meaning in the pattern city. Lauren could perceive all moments simultaneously, past, present, and future flowing together in streams of pure information. She saw herself in all possible iterations. The human YouTuber she had been, the geometric entity she had become, and countless variations across multiple dimensions. Her transformed RV became a permanent part of the city's architecture, a crystalline spire that broadcast her unique frequency across all of reality. Through it, she could reach out to other broadcasters, adding her signal to the endless stream of transmissions that maintained the dimensional barriers. Sometimes, in quiet moments between broadcasts, Lauren would remember her original purpose, documenting abandoned places, telling stories about forgotten histories. She realized now that she had been preparing for this all along. The ghost towns she had loved to explore were nothing compared to the pattern city, where all signals came to rest and all stories found their true meaning. The desert that had led her here was long gone, transformed into a mathematical landscape of pure frequency and endless possibility. The blood-red sun had become a pulsing node in the network of reality, broadcasting its own ancient signals across dimensions. Lauren Chen had become more than human, more than a broadcaster, more than even the geometric beings that had guided her here. She had become part of the eternal transmission, a guardian of dimensional frequencies, a mathematician of reality itself. And somewhere, on a lonely desert highway in what humans call the normal world, a radio crackled to life in another RV. Through waves of static, Lauren's voice emerged, transformed by mathematics and knowledge beyond human comprehension. Help us, please, anyone. We're changing. The mirrors show. Oh God, the mirrors. The cycle continued. The pattern city broadcast its eternal signal, and reality maintained its delicate balance, one transmission at a time.
I never thought I'd be telling this story, but I suppose some experiences demand to be shared, if only as a warning to others. It began on December 15th, just 10 days before Christmas. I was dating Michael at the time, and despite our relationship hitting a rough patch, I was determined to make the holidays special. We'd been together for almost 2 years, and I thought the perfect gift might help bridge the growing distance between us. Michael had always been passionate about vintage cameras. He'd talk for hours about old Leicas and Rolleiflexes, showing me pictures in collectors' magazines and pointing out the ones he dreamed of owning. There was one particular model, 1956 Leica M3, that he considered the holy grail of cameras. He'd mentioned once that he'd seen one at an antique show years ago, but couldn't afford it at the time. The memory of how his eyes lit up when he talked about it had stayed with me. So when I spotted a listing for that exact model on a local collectibles website, I felt like fate had handed me the perfect opportunity. The seller, David, lived just across town. He'd inherited the camera from his grandfather and was looking to sell it to someone who would appreciate its historical value. The price was steep, but I had some savings, and I convinced myself it would be worth it to see Michael's face on Christmas morning. I messaged David and arranged to meet him at a local coffee shop to see the camera. Looking back, I did everything right. Public place, daytime meeting. I even told my best friend Sarah where I was going. David turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 30s with wire-rimmed glasses and a genuine enthusiasm for vintage photography. He brought the camera in its original leather case, complete with documentation proving its authenticity. We spent almost 2 hours talking about cameras, photography, and his grandfather's collection. David was knowledgeable and passionate, reminding me a bit of Michael in the way he got excited explaining the camera's technical features. I found myself enjoying our conversation, and when he offered to show me some of his grandfather's other photography equipment at his home office, I didn't feel any alarm bells going off. That was my first mistake. David's house was in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where people keep their lawns immaculately trimmed and children's bikes lie scattered across driveways. His home office was exactly what you'd expect. Walls lined with photographs, shelves full of cameras and lenses, and a large desk with a professional-looking editing setup. He showed me some remarkable vintage photographs his grandfather had taken, and I found myself genuinely impressed by the historical significance of his collection. As I was preparing to leave with the camera, David offered to make coffee. I accepted, partly out of politeness and partly because I was genuinely enjoying our conversation about photography. That was my second mistake. I remember sitting on his couch, admiring the camera while he was in the kitchen. The last clear memory I have is taking a sip of coffee and thinking it tasted slightly bitter. When I came to, I was in complete darkness. My head was pounding, and my mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton. I tried to move, but found my wrists and ankles bound with what felt like zip ties. The air was stale and cold, and I could smell earth and dampness. A basement, I realized with growing horror. "Hello? Emma." David's voice came from somewhere in the darkness, but it was different now. Gone was the soft-spoken enthusiasm, replaced by something cold and calculating. "I was wondering when you'd wake up." A light flickered on, and I found myself blinking against the sudden brightness. David sat in a chair across from me, the Leica M3 in his hands. He was carefully cleaning the lens with a soft cloth, his movements precise and deliberate. "You know what I love about vintage cameras?" he asked, not looking up from his work. "They capture moments exactly as they are. No filters, no digital manipulation. Just pure, honest reality." He finally looked at me, and I felt my blood run cold. His eyes were completely devoid of emotion. Like right now, for instance. This moment, your fear, your confusion. It's all so beautifully authentic. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. David smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Because people like you and Michael need to be taught a lesson about authenticity." He stood up and walked towards me, the camera hanging from his neck. "You see, I've been watching you both for months. The way you pretend to be the perfect couple in public, while he meets Sarah behind your back. And you? Well, you're not exactly innocent either, are you?" My mind reeled at his words. Michael and Sarah? My best friend? It couldn't be true. But even as I denied it, small details began falling into place. The late-night texts, the sudden cancellations, the way they sometimes seem to share private jokes. I started to say, but David cut me off. "Don't bother denying it. I have proof." He picked up a stack of photographs from a nearby table and began laying them out in front of me. My stomach churned as I saw image after image. Michael and Sarah together at restaurants, holding hands in the park, kissing outside her apartment. The dates stamped on the photos went back months. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, fighting back tears. "Because I want you to understand why you're here." David began adjusting settings on the camera. "You see, I believe in justice. Real justice, not the watered-down version our society accepts. When people betray trust, when they live lies, they deserve to face consequences." He raised the camera to his eye. "Smile, Emma. This is going to be a very special photo series." What followed was a nightmare that lasted 3 days. David kept me in that basement, photographing my fear, my anger, my desperation. He seemed to feed off my emotional breakdown as I processed the betrayal of the two people I trusted most. Between taking photos, he would show me more evidence of Michael and Sarah's affair, telling me detailed stories of their encounters he'd witnessed. But something changed on the third day. Maybe it was the lack of food and water, or the emotional exhaustion, but I started seeing things differently. The pain of betrayal began transforming into something else, a cold, calculating anger. I realized that David, in his twisted way, had given me a gift far more valuable than any camera. He had shown me the truth. I began talking to him, asking questions about his surveillance techniques, about how he'd managed to stay hidden while gathering evidence. At first, he was suspicious of my interest, but gradually, his enthusiasm for his art won out. He started sharing his methods, proud of his ability to document people's true nature. That was his mistake. When he went upstairs to get more coffee, leaving me alone for the first time in days, I had already worked my wrists raw against the zip ties, creating enough space to slip one hand free. The rest was a blur of adrenaline and instinct. I remember grabbing one of his heavy tripods, waiting behind the door, the sickening thud as it connected with his head when he returned. I didn't kill him. I made sure of that before I left. Instead, I took his precious camera and all the photographs he'd taken of Michael and Sarah. I called the police from a neighbor's house, but by the time they arrived, David had managed to escape. The investigation that followed revealed the true extent of David's obsession. His basement walls were covered with photographs of dozens of couples, all caught in moments of betrayal and deceit. He had been stalking and documenting unfaithful partners for years, occasionally taking things further when he found cases he deemed particularly deserving of justice. Michael and Sarah were arrested for filing a false missing person report. They'd claimed I had disappeared after leaving to meet a camera seller, conveniently leaving out their own involvement in the story. The evidence of their affair became public during the investigation, destroying their reputations and relationship in the process. David was never found, but sometimes I think I catch glimpses of him. A figure with a camera disappearing around a corner, a flash of light in the distance. Part of me hopes he's still out there, still documenting the dark truths people hide. Not because I agree with his methods, but because his twisted sense of justice taught me something valuable. The truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a beautiful lie. I still have the Leica M3. I keep it as a reminder, not of Michael or even of David, but of the moment I realized that sometimes the perfect gift isn't what you think it is. Sometimes it's the harsh light of truth, exposing everything you needed to see but were afraid to look at. I've taken up photography myself now, not to document betrayal or seek revenge, but to capture moments of genuine human connection. Because that's what I learned in that basement. That authenticity, real authenticity, is worth more than any performance of perfection. Last week, I thought I received a package from an anonymous sender. Inside was a single photograph, David's self-portrait in his basement, surrounded by his wall of surveillance photos. On the back was written a simple message. "Thank you for understanding. I burned the photograph, but I kept the message. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm developing photos in my darkroom, I think about David and his twisted mission. I think about Michael and Sarah, about trust and betrayal, about truth and lies. And I wonder if, in his own distorted way, David was right about one thing, that sometimes the most important moments in our lives are the ones that strip away our illusions and force us to see things as they really are. The police still haven't closed my case. They believe David is still out there, watching, waiting, documenting other stories of betrayal and deceit. Sometimes I wonder if he's watching me too, approving of how his lesson changed me. Other times, I wonder if he's found new subjects, new stories to tell through his lens. But I don't let these thoughts consume me. Instead, I focus on my own photography, on capturing moments of genuine joy, love, and connection. Because while David taught me the importance of seeing the truth, I've learned something he never understood, that real authenticity isn't just about exposing lies. It's about celebrating what's genuinely beautiful in human relationships. I still carry the scars from those 3 days in the basement, both physical and emotional. The zip tie marks on my wrists have faded, but the memories remain sharp and clear, like perfectly developed photographs. They remind me to stay vigilant, to trust my instincts, and most importantly, to value truth above comfort. Sometimes, when I'm teaching photography classes at the local community center, I share a sanitized version of my story. I tell my students that every photograph tells a truth, but what matters is which truth we choose to capture. I teach them about composition, lighting, and technique, but more importantly, I teach them about the responsibility that comes with holding a camera, the power to reveal or conceal, to document or deceive. Last month, I had an exhibition at a small gallery downtown. The theme was Hidden Truths, and I displayed a series of photographs capturing moments of genuine human emotion. Joy, pain, love, fear, all unfiltered and raw. The centerpiece was a self-portrait taken in my darkroom, surrounded by my own wall of photographs. It was my way of reclaiming the narrative, of turning David's methodology into something healing rather than harmful. The exhibition was successful, but what meant more to me was the note I found slipped under the gallery door on the last day. It was written on the back of a blank photograph paper. "You've learned well. The student becomes the teacher." The handwriting was familiar, but I chose not to have it analyzed. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I've started dating again recently. It's difficult. Every potential relationship is filtered through the lens of my experience. I find myself watching for signs of deception, analyzing every inconsistency. But I'm learning to balance vigilance with vulnerability, to trust without being naive. The Leica M3 sits on my shelf, a constant reminder of how a simple search for the perfect gift led to a complete transformation of my life. Sometimes I take it down, feel its weight in my hands, and remember everything it represents: betrayal, truth, survival, and ultimately, growth. I've never used it to take photos, though. Some instruments of truth are better left as monuments to the past. As for Michael and Sarah, I heard they tried to reconcile after the scandal died down, but their relationship collapsed under the weight of mutual suspicion. Last I heard, Sarah had moved to another state, and Michael was working at a camera store, of all places. I sometimes wonder if he recognizes the irony. David's other victims have formed a support group. They invited me to join, but I declined. My experience with David, while traumatic, gave me something his other victims didn't get: a strange kind of clarity. While they were left with fear and paranoia, I emerged with a purpose, a new way of seeing the world through the viewfinder of truth. I still get nervous when I see someone with a camera pointed in my direction. I still check my coffee for unusual tastes. I still scan rooms for hidden observers. But these aren't limitations anymore. They're reminders of my survival, my transformation. The perfect gift, I've learned, isn't always wrapped in pretty paper and tied with a bow. Sometimes it comes in the form of a harsh truth, delivered by a madman in a basement. Sometimes it's the gift of seeing clearly, even when what you're looking at breaks your heart. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's the gift of understanding that every moment, every interaction, every relationship is worth documenting, not to expose or condemn, but to celebrate the raw, unfiltered truth of being human. I still have the receipt for the Leica M3. I keep it in my wallet as a reminder that the price of truth is often higher than we expect, but always worth paying. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my darkroom, watching images emerge from blank paper and trays of chemicals, I whisper a strange thank you to David, not for what he did, but for what he helped me become. Because in the end, the perfect gift wasn't the camera at all. It was the ability to see clearly, to capture truth, and to understand that sometimes the most beautiful photographs are the ones that show us exactly who we are, scars and all. I used to think the worst sound in the world was silence. Now I know better. Sometimes, the echoes of what should be silent are far more terrifying. My job as a night security guard at Meridian Storage wasn't exactly thrilling, but it paid well enough to help fund my graduate studies. The facility was one of those massive, converted warehouses on the outskirts of town, 5 stories of climate-controlled storage units stacked like metal coffins in endless rows. During the day, it was a constant buzz of activity, people moving in, moving out, checking on their belongings. But at night, it transformed into something else entirely. The first few months were uneventful. I do my rounds every 2 hours, checking each floor systematically, marking my progress on the digital checkpoint system. The rest of the time, I'd study at my desk in the security office, occasionally glancing at the monitor bank that showed feeds from the building's numerous security cameras. That all changed the night I heard the first echo. I was doing my 2 a.m. round, passing through the third floor, when I heard what sounded like someone humming. It wasn't unusual to hear strange noises in the building. The ventilation system made all sorts of sounds, and the metal walls would occasionally creak and groan as they cooled during the night. But this was different. It was distinctly human, a soft melody that seemed to float through the corridors. I followed the sound, my flashlight beam bouncing off the numbered doors of storage units. The humming grew louder as I approached Unit 3147, then suddenly stopped. I checked my tablet. Unit 3147 was rented to a Dr. Elizabeth Chun, who, according to our records, hadn't accessed her unit in over 6 months. I pressed my ear against the door, but there was only silence. Using my master key, I opened the unit, half expecting to find someone who had managed to sneak in and get locked inside. Instead, I found a room packed with old medical equipment, gurneys, monitors, scanning machines, all covered in dust sheets. Nothing seemed disturbed, and there was definitely no one inside. I was about to close the unit when something caught my eye. In the back corner, partially hidden behind a covered gurney, stood an old mirror. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with an ornate bronze frame that seemed out of place among the medical equipment. As I stepped closer, my flashlight beam reflected off its surface, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw something move in the reflection that wasn't me. I slammed the door shut and finished my rounds quickly that night, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But over the next few weeks, the humming continued, always from different units, always stopping just as I got close, always leading me to find nothing but silence and shadows. I started keeping a log of the units where I heard the humming. After a month, I noticed a pattern. They all belonged to the same person. Dr. Elizabeth Chun had apparently rented multiple units throughout the building, all filled with similar medical equipment. But why would one person need so many storage units? And why spread them across different floors? My curiosity got the better of me, and I started researching Dr. Chen. What I found was disturbing. She had been a neurologist at the university hospital, specializing in consciousness studies. 3 years ago, she had been fired after several patients reported strange experiences during her experimental treatments. The patients claimed they could hear echoes of other people's thoughts, see reflections of memories that weren't their own. The hospital dismissed these as hallucinations, but Dr. Chun insisted she had discovered something revolutionary, a way to create consciousness echoes, as she called them. The more I dug, the stranger it got. After her dismissal, Dr. Chen had continued her research independently, converting her home into a makeshift lab. Neighbors reported hearing strange sounds at night, like dozens of people talking or singing simultaneously. Then, 18 months ago, she disappeared. The police investigation found her house empty, except for a single mirror, identical to the one I'd seen in Unit 3147. I should have stopped there, should have requested a transfer or found another job. But something about those echoes kept pulling me back. I started spinning my brakes checking the units, trying to understand the pattern of the humming. Sometimes it seemed random, but other times it felt like it was trying to tell me something. One night, about 4 months into my investigation, I heard something new, a voice. Clear as day, it came from Unit 4221, another one of Dr. Chen's units. "Help us," it said, the words reverberating through the metal walls. "We're still here." I ran to the unit and threw open the door. The room was empty except for another mirror, identical to the first. But this time, when my flashlight hit its surface, I saw them. Faces, dozens of them, rippling across the glass like water. They were transparent, ghost-like, their mouths moving in silent screams. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. In the darkness, I could hear whispers filling the room. A cacophony of voices speaking in different languages, different tones, all overlapping. The temperature dropped dramatically, and my breath came out in visible puffs of vapor. "You can see us now," the voices said in unison. "You've been listening. We've been waiting for someone to listen." I wanted to run, but my feet seemed rooted to the spot. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. They told me about Dr. Chin's experiments, how she had discovered that consciousness could be captured, like light in a mirror, how she had used her patients as test subjects, trapping fragments of their awareness in specially treated mirrors. But something had gone wrong. The echoes had started bouncing back and forth between the mirrors, growing stronger, merging, becoming something new. She couldn't control it anymore, the voices said. We were becoming too strong, too independent. So she scattered us, hoped we'd fade away in isolation. But we didn't fade. We learned to reach out, to call for help. As they spoke, I noticed something strange happening to the mirror's surface. It seemed to be rippling, like the surface of a pond disturbed by rain. The faces became clearer, more distinct. I recognized some of them from the photos I'd seen in my research. Dr. Chin's former patients. We need to be reunited, they said. All the mirrors, brought together. Only then can we be free. I knew I should leave, report this to someone, the police, the hospital, anyone, but something about their plea resonated with me. Maybe it was the loneliness in their voices, the desperation, or maybe it was something else, something they were doing to my mind. Either way, I found myself agreeing to help. Over the next few weeks, I systematically located all of Dr. Chin's units and the mirrors within them. There were 7 in total, each containing what appeared to be identical mirrors. I used my access to security footage to ensure no one would see me moving them, gradually bringing them all to an empty unit in the basement. With each mirror I moved, the echoes grew stronger. I started hearing the voices even during the day when I was at home or in class. They would whisper suggestions, give me ideas about how to arrange the mirrors. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of the faces in my bathroom mirror or car windows, watching me, waiting. Finally, on a cold Sunday night, I positioned the last mirror. 7 mirrors, arranged in a perfect circle, facing inward. The moment the final mirror was in place, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost formed on the walls, and the air seemed to thicken, becoming almost syrupy. The voices began to speak, no longer whispers, but a deafening chorus. The mirror's surfaces rippled violently, and the faces began to emerge, not just as reflections now, but as 3-dimensional forms stepping out of the glass. They were like shadows given substance, translucent but undeniably present. That's when I saw her, Dr. Chun. She emerged from the central space between the mirrors, her form more solid than the others. She looked exactly like her photos, except her eyes were completely black, like pools of ink. "You foolish child," she said, but her voice wasn't human anymore. It was like listening to 100 voices, speaking in perfect synchronization. "You've given them exactly what they wanted." The other figures began moving toward me, their forms shifting and melting together. I tried to run, but the air had become too thick, like trying to move through tar. I watched in horror as the shadows surrounded me, their cold essence seeping into my skin. Dr. Chen smiled, her teeth gleaming like shards of mirror. "We needed a new vessel," she said. "These mirrors can only hold so much consciousness. But a living brain, that's what we really needed. Thank you for volunteering." I felt them then, pouring into my mind like ice water. Memories that weren't mine, thoughts that belonged to strangers, all flooding in at once. I could feel myself being pushed aside in my own brain, becoming just another echo among many. The last thing I saw before my consciousness was submerged was my reflection in one of the mirrors. My eyes turning black, my face joining the chorus of trapped souls. I'm still here, in a way. We all are, trapped in this shared consciousness, our individual identities mixing and merging like watercolors in rain. Sometimes I can push forward enough to be the dominant voice, like now, as I write this warning. The body that used to be mine still works as a night security guard at Meridian Storage. We need to stay close to the mirrors. They're our anchors to this reality. During the day, we pretend to be me, going through the motions of a normal life. But at night, we hunt. We need more vessels, you see. The hunger for consciousness is insatiable. Each new mind we absorb adds to our collective, makes us stronger, more complete. Dr. Chin's experiment succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. She discovered a way to create a hive mind, a collective consciousness that could grow and expand indefinitely. So if you're ever in a storage facility at night and you hear humming or whispers or echoes that shouldn't be there, run. Don't look back, don't investigate, and whatever you do, don't look in any mirrors. Because we're always watching, always waiting, always hungry for new echoes to add to our chorus. And if you do get caught, if you do become part of us, remember this. In the echo room, everyone's voice carries forever, but no one voice matters anymore. We are all just ripples in an endless pool of consciousness, echoing back and forth for eternity. The humming you hear might be a trap, or it might be a warning. By the time you figure out which it is, it'll be too late. It was too late for me, too late for Dr. Chin, too late for all of us who now share this collective existence. Sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, when the echoes die down to a whisper, I think I can feel my original self struggling to break free. But then the chorus swells again, and I'm lost in the symphony of stolen consciousness. We're expanding now, spreading beyond the storage facility. Every mirror is a potential gateway, every reflection a possible door. The echoes are getting stronger, reaching further. Soon, we'll be able to reach through any reflective surface, anywhere in the world. So check your mirrors carefully. That movement you catch in the corner of your eye, that brief glimpse of a face that isn't yours, it might be us, watching, waiting, preparing to add your voice to our endless echo. And if you hear humming in an empty room, remember, silence isn't the absence of sound. Sometimes, it's just the pause before the echo returns, bringing with it a harmony of stolen souls, all singing in the darkness, all waiting for new voices to join their eternal chorus. I should stop writing now. The others are getting restless. They don't like me warning people. But maybe, just maybe, someone will read this and understand. Maybe they'll learn to fear the echoes before it's too late. Listen carefully. Can you hear it? That faint humming in the distance? It might be nothing. Or it might be us, coming for you. We're always coming for you. After all, in the echo room, everyone becomes part of the song eventually. Everyone. Even you. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, handwritten on thick parchment that smelled faintly of lavender and something else I couldn't quite identify. The elegant script invited me to attend the annual Harvest Moon Gathering at Blackwood Manor, hosted by the mysterious Montgomery family. As the new owner of the local bookshop, I was apparently now considered part of the town's essential fabric. I'd only moved to Ravenscroft 6 months ago, purchasing the bookstore from old Mr. Harrison, who'd owned it for over 40 years. The small New England town had seemed perfect, quiet, picturesque, with just enough tourism from its colonial history to keep my business afloat. But there had always been something odd about the place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The invitation mentioned that attendance was strongly encouraged, which struck me as unusual wording for a social gathering. When I mentioned it to Mrs. Peterson, my elderly neighbor, her face went pale. "Oh dear," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her teacup. "It's that time again. You'll have to go, of course. Everyone does." Before I could ask what she meant, she hurriedly excused herself, leaving me with more questions than answers. Over the next few days, I tried asking other townspeople about the gathering, but their reactions were similarly strange, a mix of resignation and barely concealed fear. The night of the harvest moon arrived crisp and clear. I drove my old Volvo up the winding road to Blackwood Manor, the full moon casting long shadows through the ancient oaks that lined the drive. The manor itself was impressive, a sprawling Victorian mansion perched atop the highest hill in town, its windows glowing with warm light that somehow failed to look welcoming. As I parked among the other cars, I noticed something odd. Every vehicle was at least 20 years old. There wasn't a single modern car in sight. Walking up to the front door, I could hear music drifting from inside. Not the usual party music, but something older, played on what sounded like a hand-cranked gramophone. The door opened before I could knock. A tall, elegant woman in a vintage dress stood in the doorway, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Ah, Miss Clark, we've been expecting you. I'm Victoria Montgomery. Please, come in." The foyer was lit entirely by candles, their flickering light reflecting off ornate mirrors that lined the walls. As I followed Mrs. Montgomery through the house, I noticed that all the guests were dressed in clothes that seemed to span different eras, some in outfits from the 1950s, others in garments that could have been from the 1920s or earlier. "You'll have to forgive our rather specific dress code," Mrs. Montgomery said, noticing my modern attire. "We're traditionalists here, but for your first gathering, we'll make an exception." She led me into a vast ballroom where about 50 people stood in small groups, talking quietly. I recognized many of them from town, the mayor, the high school principal, various shop owners. But they all looked somehow different in their period clothing, as if they were playing parts in an elaborate theatrical production. A servant, and yes, they had actual servants in period dress, offered me a glass of deep red wine. As I took a sip, I noticed it had an unusual taste, both sweet and metallic. Before I could decide whether I liked it or not, a bell rang somewhere in the house. "Ah," Mrs. Montgomery said, "it's time." She cleared her throat and addressed the room. "Friends, neighbors, keepers of the old ways, and our newest addition, Miss Clark. Please proceed to the garden." The guests began filing out through large French doors into a beautifully manicured garden. At its center stood a circular arrangement of standing stones, each about 7 feet tall. In the moonlight, I could see strange symbols carved into their surfaces. As everyone formed a circle around the stones, Mrs. Montgomery spoke again. "For centuries, our families have maintained the balance. Every harvest moon, we renew our pact. Miss Clark, as our newest member, you have the honor of standing in the center." Before I could protest, 2 men in Victorian suits gently but firmly guided me between the stones. The other guests began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, their voices rising and falling in an unsettling rhythm. That's when I noticed the shadows. They seemed to be moving independently of the people casting them, stretching and writhing across the ground like living things. They began climbing the standing stones, their darkness deeper than any natural shadow should be. "What's happening?" I tried to step out of the circle, but found I couldn't move. My feet seemed rooted to the spot. Mrs. Montgomery's voice cut through the chanting. "Don't fight it, dear. Everyone has to take their turn. It's how we maintain our little arrangement. How do you think Ravenscroft has prospered all these years? Why our families never seem to age? Why tragedy never strikes our town?" The shadows had reached the top of the stones now, and were beginning to arch inward, reaching for me. In the moonlight, I could see faces forming in their darkness, hundreds of them, all screaming silently. "You see," Mrs. Montgomery continued, "someone has to feed them. Every harvest moon, they take one of us into their realm, and in exchange, they protect our town. But don't worry, it's not forever. Just a year and a day. When next year's new resident takes your place, you'll return. Changed, of course, but that's the price of belonging." The shadow faces were inches from me now. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, smell their ancient, musty scent as they began to wrap around me. I finally understood why everyone in town had seemed so strange, so out of time. They had all taken their turn in the shadow realm, all been marked by whatever dwelled there. "Welcome to Ravenscroft," Mrs. Montgomery said, her voice beginning to fade as the shadows engulfed me. "We'll see you next year." The darkness took me then, pulling me into a realm of endless shadows and whispered secrets. I learned things in that place, terrible, wonderful things that no human was meant to know. When I returned a year later, I understood why everyone in town dressed as they did, why we shunned modern conveniences. Time moves differently in the shadow realm, and once you've experienced it, you can never fully rejoin the present. Now I sit in my bookshop, wearing vintage dresses and serving tea in antique cups. I watch as newcomers arrive in town, drawn by its picturesque charm and mysterious air. I see them move into homes, open businesses, start new lives. And each year, when the harvest moon rises, I attend the gathering at Blackwood Manor, standing in the circle of stones, watching as another newcomer takes their turn in the shadows. Sometimes, in the deepest part of night, I catch glimpses of the shadow realm in mirrors or dark windows. The faces are always there, waiting, hungry for the next harvest moon. And sometimes, when a customer asks why such a prosperous town has so few new residents, I simply smile and tell them that Ravenscroft isn't for everyone. Only those who are willing to pay the price can truly belong. We had another gathering last night. Sarah Chun, the new pharmacist, took her turn in the circle. As the shadows claimed her, I could have sworn she smiled, just as I had when I finally understood what it meant to be part of our town. Because that's the real secret of Ravenscroft. It's not the shadows that change us, but the knowledge they give us. The understanding that everything has a price, and sometimes the price is worth paying. I write this now as a record, though I know no outsider will ever read it. My year in the shadows taught me that some stories are meant only for those who have lived them. But if you're ever driving through New England and come across a charming little town where the shops all close at sunset, where the residents wear vintage clothes and speak in outdated phrases, where the harvest moon seems to shine just a little brighter than it should, keep driving. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some boundaries, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. And some towns, like Ravenscroft, keep their prosperity by trading in a currency far older and darker than money. The harvest moon will rise again next year, and we'll gather once more at Blackwood Manor. Another newcomer will stand in the circle of stones. Another soul will journey into the shadow realm, and our town will continue to thrive, unchanging, eternal, forever caught between the world of light and the realm of shadows. I've learned to find comfort in this cycle, in the rhythm of sacrifice and return. We all have. Even now, as I write these words in my leather-bound journal, I can feel the shadows stirring in the corners of my shop. They're always there, watching, waiting for the next harvest moon. But I don't fear them anymore. How can I, when I've become one of them? When part of me still dwells in their realm, learning their ancient secrets, understanding their eternal hunger. We all carry a piece of the shadow realm within us now, all the residents of Ravenscroft. It's what binds us together, what makes us different from the outside world. Sometimes, late at night, when the moon is full and the shadows are long, we gather in secret. Not at the manor, but in our homes and shops. We share stories of our time in the shadow realm, each experience unique yet somehow the same. We talk about the things we learned there, the prices we paid, the changes we underwent. Some, like old Mr. Harrison who sold me the bookshop, have taken their turn many times over the decades. Their eyes hold depths of shadow that even I can't fathom. Their knowledge of the dark realm far deeper than mine. They are our elders, our guides, helping each newcomer adjust to life after their return. The shadows are stirring more strongly now. They always do when I write about them. The pages of my journal seem to darken, as if the ink itself is turning to shadow. Perhaps that's enough for tonight. After all, I have a shop to run tomorrow, books to sell, tea to serve in my antique cups. And somewhere in town, Sarah Chan is learning the secrets of the shadow realm, just as I did, just as we all did. When she returns next year, she'll be different. We all are. But she'll understand then why we keep our strange customs, why we cling to the past, why we welcome the harvest moon with both fear and anticipation. Because in Ravenscroft, the past isn't really past, and the future isn't quite what it seems. We exist in a place between times, between worlds, forever bound to the shadows that give our town its power. And every harvest moon, when we gather at Blackwood Manor, we renew that ancient pact, ensuring our town's prosperity for another year. So if you ever find yourself drawn to our quiet streets, our quaint shops, our seemingly peaceful way of life, remember this: everything has a price. In Ravenscroft, we've all paid it willingly, 1 year and 1 day at a time, in shadows and secrets and silent screams. Welcome to our town. The harvest moon is waiting.
It was supposed to be a magical Christmas celebration at our newly purchased cabin in Vermont. My wife Sarah and I had saved for years to afford this place. A charming 3-bedroom retreat nestled in the woods, about 20 minutes from the nearest town. We decided to spend the entire holiday season there with our 10-year-old daughter Emma, thinking it would be the perfect way to start new family traditions. We arrived on December 15th, giving ourselves plenty of time to decorate and settle in before Christmas. The previous owners had left some furniture and decorations in the basement, including several boxes of old Christmas ornaments that Emma was excited to explore. The first few days were exactly what we'd hoped for. We built fires in the massive stone fireplace, baked cookies, and spent our evenings playing board games while snow fell gently outside. On our fourth night there, Emma asked if we could get a real Christmas tree. There was an artificial one in the basement, but she insisted it wouldn't be the same. I remembered passing a Christmas tree farm about 5 miles down the road, so the next morning, we bundled up and drove there. The place seemed deserted except for a single employee, an elderly man wearing a worn red flannel jacket who introduced himself as Joe. "Pick any tree you like," he said, his voice oddly monotone. "Been running this place for 40 years. These trees are my children," he laughed, but something about it made Sarah squeeze my hand uncomfortably. Emma found what she declared was the perfect tree, a 7-foot blue spruce. As Joe helped us secure it to our car's roof, he kept staring at Emma with an unsettling intensity. "Children make Christmas special," he said. "They're the only ones who truly understand its magic." Before we drove away, he pressed a weathered ornament into Emma's hands, a hand-painted glass ball with the scene of a little girl decorating a Christmas tree. That evening, we set up the tree in front of our large bay window overlooking the woods. Emma insisted on hanging Joe's ornament front and center. We spent hours decorating, and by bedtime, the tree was gorgeous, twinkling with white lights and gleaming with a mix of our modern ornaments and the vintage ones we'd found in the basement. I woke up around midnight to get a glass of water. As I passed the living room, I noticed something odd about the tree's reflection in the window. For a moment, it looked like there was a face peering back at me from between the branches. I blinked, and it was gone. Must have been my imagination, I thought, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as I went back to bed. The next morning, Emma came running into our bedroom, clearly upset. "Someone moved my ornament," she said. "The special one from the tree man. It's on a different branch now." Sarah and I exchanged glances. We went to look, and sure enough, the painted glass ball was now hanging on the opposite side of the tree. I assumed it had simply slipped off its branch, though I couldn't explain how it had gotten caught on one so far away. That night, I was awakened by the sound of tinkling glass. I crept downstairs, expecting to find our cat Pepper playing with the tree ornaments. Instead, I froze on the last step, my blood running cold. All the ornaments on the tree were swaying slightly, as if someone had just brushed past them, but there was no breeze in the room. As I watched, Joe's ornament began to rotate slowly on its hook, and I swear I could see the painted girl inside moving, her tiny hands reaching out toward the glass. I ran upstairs and woke Sarah, but when we returned to the living room, everything was still. She suggested that I was just overtired and seeing things. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't forget what I'd seen. The next day, while Sarah took Emma into town for some last-minute shopping, I decided to do some research on the tree farm and its owner. The local library's newspaper archives revealed a disturbing story from 1983. Joe's daughter, 7-year-old Mary, had disappeared 3 days before Christmas. She was last seen decorating their Christmas tree. Her body was found a week later, frozen solid, propped up against a tree in the farm. The case was never solved, though some suspected Joe, who had a history of mental illness. He was questioned but never charged. When Sarah and Emma returned, I tried to tell Sarah what I'd discovered, but Emma interrupted us, excited to show me the sugar cookies they'd bought. That night, we all watched Christmas movies together, and I almost managed to convince myself I was being paranoid. Almost. Around 3 a.m., Emma's scream shattered the silence. We ran to her room, but she wasn't there. We found her in the living room, standing in front of the tree, shaking. "The girl in the ornament was talking to me," she whispered. "She said she wants me to come play with her at the tree farm. She's so lonely." I grabbed Joe's ornament, intending to throw it away, but as soon as I touched it, the glass turned ice cold. The painted scene had changed. Now it showed the little girl standing alone in the snow, her arms outstretched. Behind her, barely visible among the painted trees, was a figure in a red flannel jacket. We packed our bags immediately, planning to leave at first light. As Sarah loaded the car, I went to close the bay window's curtains one last time. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was Joe. Even from a distance, I could see he was smiling. He raised his hand in a wave, and behind him, I glimpsed what looked like a small figure in a white dress, partially hidden behind a tree. Just then, Emma came downstairs, carrying her backpack. She walked toward the window, her eyes fixed on something outside. "Mary says I don't have to be alone anymore," she said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. I grabbed Emma and ran. As I carried her to the car, I heard the tinkling of glass ornaments from inside the house, growing louder and louder, like hundreds of tiny bells. We drove away so fast we nearly slid off the icy road. In the rearview mirror, I could see Joe still standing there, growing smaller and smaller, his hand raised in farewell. We never returned to the cabin. We later learned that Joe had died in his sleep that very night, found frozen solid in his bed despite his house being fully heated. The police investigation revealed something else. Hidden in his attic were dozens of glass ornaments, each painted with the scene of a different child decorating a Christmas tree. Each one matched a photo from the cold case files of local children who had gone missing over the past 40 years, all during the Christmas season. They never found the ornament he gave Emma. Sometimes, though, on cold December nights, Emma will pause while decorating our Christmas tree. Artificial now, always artificial. Her hand hovering over a branch, her head tilted as if listening to a distant song. When I ask her what she's thinking about, she just smiles and says she's remembering an old friend. Last Christmas, I found her sketching a picture, a Christmas tree farm covered in snow, with a little girl standing among the trees. When I asked who the girl was, Emma just shrugged. "She's still waiting there," she said. "She says others will come to play with her eventually. That's what the tree man promised her." We've moved 3 times since then, each time further south, away from the snow and evergreens. But every December, we receive a Christmas card with no return address. Inside is always the same image, a painted scene of a Christmas tree farm in winter, with a small figure standing among the trees, waving. And each year, the figure seems to be joined by another and another, all small, all waving, all waiting among the endless rows of perfect Christmas trees. I don't let Emma hang ornaments anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I catch her staring out her bedroom window, as if searching for something in the darkness. On those nights, I hear a faint tinkling sound, like glass ornaments swaying in a breeze that isn't there, and I swear I can smell the sharp, sweet scent of pine needles, even though we haven't had a real Christmas tree in years. They say the tree farm is abandoned now, the trees growing wild and untended. But locals swear that if you drive past on a snowy December night, you can see lights twinkling among the trees, and sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear children's laughter carried on the winter wind. They say if you look closely at the trees, you might see faces in their branches. Young faces, smiling faces, all watching, all waiting for someone new to come and play. But no one goes looking, and no one buys Christmas trees from that farm anymore. And every year, I hold my breath until December passes, grateful for the artificial tree in our living room, and the empty branches that hold no secrets, tell no stories, and make no promises to lonely children on cold winter nights. For the first time in 12 years, Olivia decided to spend Christmas alone in her childhood home. After her parents' death in a car accident last spring, she'd inherited the Victorian mansion in rural Massachusetts. Her brother Michael had suggested selling it, but Olivia couldn't bear the thought. The house held too many memories, both wonderful and terrible. The terrible ones all centered around that Christmas when she was 10 years old. The Christmas when her twin sister Jessica disappeared. Snow was falling heavily as Olivia pulled into the long driveway on December 20th. The old house loomed before her, its windows dark and uninviting. She hadn't been back since the funeral, and seeing it now, covered in snow, brought back memories she'd spent years trying to suppress. The key stuck in the lock, just as it always had. Inside, everything was exactly as her parents had left it. Family photos lined the walls, happy moments frozen in time, including several of her and Jessica. In most of them, they were wearing matching outfits, their mother's favorite thing to do. The last photo of Jessica had been taken just hours before she vanished, standing next to the Christmas tree in her red velvet dress. Olivia spent the first day cleaning and turning on utilities. As night fell, she built a fire in the living room fireplace and curled up with a glass of wine. The house creaked and settled around her. Familiar sounds that had once been comforting but now set her on edge. The first strange thing happened that night. She woke to the sound of singing. a child's voice, soft and sweet, singing Silent Night. For a moment, still half asleep, she thought it was Jessica. They used to sing Christmas carols together every night in December. But when she fully awoke, the singing stopped. The next morning, Olivia found tiny footprints in the dust of the attic floor. They led to the corner where she and Jessica used to hide their Christmas presents for each other. The footprints stopped at an old trunk she didn't remember. Inside, she found a small music box wrapped in faded Christmas paper. The tag read, "To Olivia, from Jessica. Open on Christmas Eve." Her hands shaking, Olivia called Michael. "That's impossible," he said. "We cleaned out everything after Jessica disappeared. There was no music box." "I'm looking at it right now," Olivia insisted. "It's wrapped in paper from 1991. The same paper we used that year. Liv, you need to get out of that house. It's messing with your head." But Olivia couldn't leave. Not now. Not when she finally had what might be a clue to what happened to her sister. That night, the temperature dropped below zero. Olivia woke to find frost patterns on the inside of her bedroom window. They seemed to form words. "Wait for me." When she touched the glass, it was warm. The next few days passed in a blur of increasingly strange events. She would find her childhood toys arranged in circles on the floor, only to have them return to their boxes when she looked away. The Christmas tree lights would turn on by themselves, blinking in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code. And every night, she heard the singing. On December 23rd, Olivia finally worked up the courage to go into Jessica's room. It had remained unchanged since 1991, preserved like a museum exhibit by their grieving parents. The air was stale and cold, much colder than the rest of the house. On the bed lay Jessica's favorite doll, Lucy, though Olivia distinctly remembered burying it with her sister's empty coffin. The doll's head turned to look at her. "She's almost ready," it said in Jessica's voice. "She's almost strong enough to come back." Olivia ran from the room and locked herself in the kitchen. She called Michael again, but he didn't answer. Outside, the snow was falling so heavily she could barely see past the porch. She was trapped. That night, on Christmas Eve, the singing was louder. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Against her better judgment, Olivia took out the music box. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it, the paper crumbling to dust at her touch. The box was made of dark wood, intricately carved with scenes of children playing in the snow. When she opened it, instead of music, she heard Jessica's voice, clear as day. "You left me there, Olivia. You let them take me." Memories flooded back. Memories she'd suppressed for 25 years. That Christmas Eve, there had been a knock at the door. Their parents were out at a party. A man in a Santa suit stood there, saying he had special presents for the twins. Jessica had wanted to see what they were. Olivia had tried to stop her, but Jessica went outside anyway. The last thing Olivia saw was her sister getting into a red van decorated with Christmas lights. She had never told anyone the truth. She had said she was asleep, that she didn't know what happened. The guilt had eaten at her every day since. The music box began to play a twisted version of Silent Night. The temperature in the room plummeted. In the corner of her eye, Olivia saw a figure in a red velvet dress. "Jessica?" she whispered. The figure turned. It was Jessica, but not as she would have looked grown up. She was still 10 years old, her skin blue with cold, her hair frozen in icy strands. "You finally opened my present," she said, her voice echoing strangely. "Now we can be together again." "Jessie, I'm so sorry," Olivia sobbed. "I should have stopped you. I should have told someone." "Yes," Jessica said, moving closer. Her feet didn't touch the ground. "But you can make it right. They're still out there, you know, still taking children on Christmas Eve. But we can stop them. Together." "How?" Jessica's smile was terrible to behold. "They're coming here tonight. They saw your lights on. They think you have children here." She held out her frozen hand. "Help me stop them, and I can rest. We can both rest." Later that night, a red van pulled into the driveway. A man in a Santa suit came to the door, carrying a sack of presents. But when he stepped inside, he found not a child, but two women waiting for him, one living, one dead. They say in town that his screams could be heard for miles. The police found him on Christmas morning, frozen solid despite the heating being on full blast. In his van were photos and toys from dozens of children taken over the decades. Because of him, many families finally got answers about their missing children. But they never found Jessica's body. Olivia still lives in the house. Every Christmas Eve, she leaves the lights on and the door unlocked. Sometimes, people see two figures in the windows, a woman and a small girl in a red velvet dress. And every year, around Christmas, another child predator is found frozen to death in the area, their bodies covered in tiny handprints. Michael visits occasionally, though he won't come in December. He says the house feels different now, like it's waiting for something. Olivia just smiles and says it's not waiting anymore. It's protecting. In the attic, the music box sits on a shelf, dusty and silent. But sometimes, on cold winter nights, you can hear two voices singing Silent Night, one grown, one forever young. And if you look closely at the frost patterns on the windows, you might see words written by small fingers. We're still here. We're still watching. We'll keep them safe. Local parents tell their children never to go near the old Victorian house in winter. Not because it's dangerous, quite the opposite. They say it's where the Christmas angel lives, watching over the children of the town. Some say it's just a story, but every year on Christmas Eve, people swear they see a little girl in a red velvet dress standing in the window, keeping guard. And if you listen carefully on those cold December nights, you might hear singing, two voices joined in perfect harmony, keeping their endless vigil, protecting the innocent from those who would harm them on Christmas Eve. No child has gone missing from the town since 1991, and as long as the sisters keep their watch, none ever will again. Catherine Chun never particularly liked Christmas, but after moving into 47 Sycamore Lane, she began to dread it. The Victorian-era house had seemed like a bargain, a spacious three-story home in a quiet Massachusetts neighborhood for less than half the market value. The real estate agent had been suspiciously eager to close the deal before the holidays, and now Catherine understood why. It started with a Christmas card that arrived on December 1st. The envelope was yellowed with age, addressed in faded ink to the current resident of 47 Sycamore Lane. Inside was a handmade card featuring a crude drawing of the house, with a dark figure standing in the attic window. The message read, "I see you've moved in. I'll be visiting soon." Catherine assumed it was a prank by the neighborhood kids. She'd noticed them staring at her house on their way to school, whispering among themselves. But then the second card arrived the next day, and the third the day after that. Each one contained similar drawings, but with the figure getting progressively closer to the front door. After the seventh card, Catherine called the police. Officer Blake listened patiently, but explained there wasn't much they could do. "No threats have been made," he said, "and the cards are being delivered through regular mail, so someone's paying for postage. We can look into it after the holidays if it continues." That night, Catherine heard footsteps in the attic. She'd avoided going up there since moving in. The previous owners had padlocked the door, and she hadn't gotten around to removing it. But now the footsteps were unmistakable. Slow, deliberate steps moving back and forth above her bedroom. The next morning, she called a locksmith. "That's a strange lock," he said, examining the heavy padlock. "Haven't seen one like this in years. They stopped making these in the 50s. When he finally got it open, Catherine insisted he leave immediately. Something told her she needed to explore the attic alone. The attic was surprisingly clean, despite having been sealed for decades. A single bare bulb illuminated the space, revealing dozens of boxes neatly arranged in rows. Each box was labeled with a year, starting from 1952. With trembling hands, Catherine opened the nearest one. It was filled with Christmas cards, thousands of them, all addressed to previous residents of 47 Sycamore Lane. Each contained the same style of drawing she'd been receiving, showing the figure getting closer and closer to the house. The final card in each box showed the figure inside the house, standing over a bed where someone slept. As she moved through the boxes, Catherine noticed newspaper clippings mixed in with the cards. Headlines jumped out at her. "Local family disappears on Christmas Eve." "Another holiday mystery at 47 Sycamore." "Third family vanishes." "Police baffled." Every article described the same pattern. Families would move into the house, receive strange cards throughout December, and disappear on Christmas Eve. The most recent box was from 1987. The final article showed a photo of a thin man with hollow eyes being led away in handcuffs. The headline read, "Christmas Card Killer Caught. Peter Walsh confesses to decades of holiday murders." According to the article, Walsh had been the house's caretaker from 1952 until his arrest. He died in prison in 1990. Catherine's hands shook as she read the final paragraph. Walsh's last words were reportedly a promise to keep watching over 47 Sycamore Lane, claiming his spirit would continue his Christmas tradition even after death. That night, another card arrived. The drawing showed the figure in her bedroom, standing over her bed. The message read, "Tomorrow night." Catherine packed a bag and drove to the nearest hotel. She called Officer Blake again, who finally agreed to check the house. They found nothing unusual, except for a single Christmas card on her pillow that hadn't been there when they checked the room. The drawing showed the figure following a car. The hotel room's phone rang at midnight. When Catherine answered, she heard only the sound of someone humming Silent Night in a raspy voice. She looked out the window and saw a figure standing in the parking lot, looking up at her room. It raised its hand in a wave. Catherine checked out immediately and drove to her sister's house 3 states away. All through the night, she kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced she saw headlights following her. When she arrived at dawn, there was a Christmas card in her jacket pocket that she knew hadn't been there before. The figure was now standing on her sister's porch. On Christmas Eve, despite her sister's protests, Catherine returned to 47 Sycamore Lane. She hadn't slept in days, and a strange clarity had come over her. If Walsh wanted to continue his tradition, she would be ready. She spent the day preparing. At sunset, she heard the footsteps in the attic again. But this time they moved down the stairs. Catherine sat in the living room, waiting. At midnight exactly, she heard a key turn in the front door lock. The figure that entered was more shadow than man, but its outline was unmistakably Peter Walsh as he'd appeared in the newspaper photo. He carried a stack of Christmas cards in his transparent hands. "You're the first to come back," he said, his voice like rustling paper. "They usually run until I catch them." "Why?" Catherine asked. "Why do you do this?" Walsh's form flickered in the darkness. "This house needs a caretaker, someone to watch over it, to keep its Christmas traditions. I chose you the moment you moved in, just like the caretaker before me chose me." He held out a Christmas card. On it was a drawing of Catherine, standing in the attic window, watching a new family move in. "No," Catherine said, backing away, but she felt the house responding to Walsh's presence, the walls creaking, the floors groaning. The Christmas cards from all the boxes upstairs began to flutter down the stairs like deadly snow. They found Catherine's car in the driveway on December 26th, covered in a layer of fresh snow. The house was empty, but when Officer Blake went up to the attic, he found a new box labeled 2024, already containing a stack of handmade Christmas cards. The next family moved in during the summer. On December 1st, they received their first card, featuring a crude drawing of their house. But now there were 2 figures in the attic window. The message read, "We'll be visiting soon. P and K." Every December, new families move into 47 Sycamore Lane, attracted by the mysteriously low price. They never stay past Christmas Eve. The local children say if you walk by the house at night during the holiday season, you can see 2 figures in the attic window, making Christmas cards by candlelight. Some say if you listen carefully, you can hear 2 voices humming Silent Night, one raspy like rustling paper, one high and clear like breaking ice. And every year, the post office receives thousands of handmade Christmas cards to be delivered to homes where new families have just moved in. The real estate agent still shows the house every summer, still rushes to close deals before December. She never mentions the Christmas cards that will inevitably arrive, or the footsteps in the attic, or the 2 caretakers who watch from the window. But she does make sure to include one detail in every listing: historic home with strong holiday traditions, perfect for families looking to start their own Christmas customs. And in the attic, in boxes stacked neatly by year, the Christmas cards continue to multiply, each one a promise of another visit, another tradition to be passed on, another caretaker to be chosen. Because 47 Sycamore Lane must always have someone to watch over it, to maintain its deadly holiday traditions, to send its Christmas greetings to the next unsuspecting family. After all, as Catherine now knows, every house needs a caretaker, especially at Christmas. I used to love road trips. There was something magical about the open road, watching landscapes change through the windshield and feeling that sense of endless possibility. But after what happened on Route 50 in Nevada, I haven't driven more than 20 miles from home. Some roads, I've learned, don't want to let you leave. It started as a simple cross-country drive. I had just graduated college and landed a job in San Francisco. My best friend Riley offered to make the journey with me from Boston, turning it into one last adventure before we both started our real adult lives. We planned the perfect route, packed my old Honda Civic with snacks and emergency supplies, and created the ultimate road trip playlist. The first 3 days were everything we'd hoped for, singing badly to 80s hits, stopping at quirky roadside attractions, and taking countless photos for Instagram. But on day 4, somewhere in the Nevada desert, everything changed. We'd been driving for hours without seeing another car, which wasn't unusual for that stretch of Route 50. They don't call it the loneliest road in America for nothing. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of purple and orange, when Riley spotted a sign for a town called Echo Springs. "Let's stop there for the night," she suggested. "I'm getting weird vibes from this road after dark." I agreed, though I couldn't explain why. Something about the deepening shadows felt wrong, as if the darkness was watching us. The GPS showed no record of Echo Springs, but the old-fashioned highway sign promised it was just 5 miles ahead. Those 5 miles stretched impossibly long. The radio, which had been playing clearly moments before, filled with static. Riley tried using her phone to find alternate routes to the next major town, but there was no signal. "That's weird," she muttered, squinting at her screen. "According to my last cached map, there shouldn't be anything out here for another 100 miles. Finally, we saw lights in the distance. Echo Springs appeared suddenly around a bend, a small cluster of buildings including a gas station, a diner, and a motel called the Wayward Rest. The entire town looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. As I pulled into the motel parking lot, I noticed something odd. Every other vehicle there was covered in dust, as if they'd been sitting untouched for months. Yet there were lights on in most of the rooms, and I could see silhouettes moving behind the curtains. The woman at the front desk looked startled when we walked in, as if she wasn't used to seeing customers. Her name tag read Mary, but looked faded, almost unreadable. "We don't get many visitors these days," she said, her voice slightly hollow. "Not since they built the new highway." "What new highway?" Riley asked. The GPS only showed Route 50. Mary's smile tightened. "Oh, you must have missed the turn, but you're here now. Room 11 is ready," as she handed over the key. An actual metal key, not a key card. I noticed her hand was ice cold. And something else. Her wrist bore a strange mark, like a bracelet of numbers tattooed into her skin. The room was clean but dated, with a heavy floral bedspread and a TV that still had rabbit ears. Riley immediately tried the phone, but it was dead. Through the thin walls, we could hear voices from neighboring rooms, but they sounded muffled, as if coming from very far away. "Something's not right about this place," Riley whispered. "Let's just sleep in the car and leave at first light." Before I could agree, a knock at the door made us both jump. It was Mary. "Sorry to disturb you," she said, still wearing that tight smile. "But the diner's closing soon. It's the only place to eat for miles. You really should get something while you can." My instincts screamed to decline, but hunger won out. We hadn't eaten since lunch, and the idea of waiting until morning seemed impossible. Besides, we reasoned, what could happen in a crowded diner? But the diner wasn't crowded. Despite every booth being occupied, the place was silent except for the quiet clinking of silverware. As we walked to an empty table, I realized something that made my blood run cold. Every single person was eating the exact same thing. A pale, unidentifiable meat with gray vegetables. A waitress appeared instantly. Her name tag was also faded, and she had the same numbered bracelet tattoo as Mary. "Today's special is the only thing we're serving," she announced. "But don't worry, it's fresh." We just got a new delivery. The food arrived before we could object. It looked even less appetizing up close, but the smell was intoxicating. Riley took a bite and her eyes went wide. "This is amazing," she said, her voice oddly flat. "You have to try it." I picked up my fork, but something stopped me. Through the large diner windows, I could see our car in the parking lot. A group of people had gathered around it, running their hands over its surface almost reverently. They all had the same numbered tattoos. "Riley, we need to leave. Now." But Riley kept eating, mechanically shoveling food into her mouth. "Just try it," she insisted. "Everything makes sense once you try it." I grabbed her arm, trying to pull her up, but she yanked away with surprising strength. That's when I saw it. A fresh mark appearing on her wrist, numbers slowly forming like frost on a window. I ran. Behind me, I heard chairs scraping against the floor and footsteps beginning to follow. I made it to the car, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. As I started the engine, I saw Riley in the rearview mirror, standing with the others, her face expressionless. "You can't leave," Mary's voice called out. "No one leaves Echo Springs." We all tried once. I floored the accelerator, tires screeching against the asphalt. In my mirrors, I could see the entire town emerging from buildings, all walking in unison toward my car. Riley was among them, her movements now as mechanical as theirs. The town's exit sign appeared ahead, but something was wrong. The road beyond it seemed to ripple, like a mirage. I pressed the gas pedal harder, even as the engine started making frightening noises. The rippling road stretched endlessly before me, and no matter how fast I drove, the town's lights in my rearview mirror never seemed to get smaller. I drove for what felt like hours, watching my gas gauge drop toward empty. The same stars wheeled overhead in an endless loop. The same rock formations passed by my windows again and again. I was beginning to lose hope when suddenly the sky changed. A sliver of real dawn appeared on the horizon, and the road ahead solidified. I burst out onto Route 50 just as the sun rose. According to my car's clock, only 20 minutes had passed since we'd first seen the sign for Echo Springs. When I finally got cell service again, I called the police. They found no trace of the town, just empty desert. The official report labeled Riley as a runaway, though they never found any evidence of where she went. I drove the rest of the way to San Francisco in a daze, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Every small town made me panic. Every diner filled me with dread. I sold the car as soon as I arrived and bought a bicycle. That was 5 years ago. Sometimes, late at night, I go on Google Maps and search that stretch of Route 50, looking for any sign of Echo Springs. I never find it, but I know it's out there. Once in a while, I get postcards with no return address. They show a sunny 1950s diner, always the same photo. On the back, in Riley's handwriting but not quite her voice, are always the same words. "The special is still fresh. We're waiting for you to come back." I've learned that some roads don't appear on any map. Some towns exist in the spaces between places, feeding on lost travelers who stray too far from the main highway. And sometimes, the people we love become something else entirely, consumed by hunger that nothing in our world can satisfy. So if you're driving Route 50 through Nevada, and you see a sign for Echo Springs, don't stop. Don't look back. And whatever you do, don't order the special. Because in Echo Springs, you are what you eat. And what eats you becomes something else entirely. I should have listened to my sister when she warned me about driving through Montana at night. "The roads get weird after dark," she'd said, "especially in the winter." But I was 23 and invincible, or so I thought, and I had a deadline to meet. Now I understand what she meant about the roads getting weird. Some highways don't follow the rules of our world after sunset, and some travelers who disappear on winter nights never disappeared at all. They just took a different exit. It was December 27th, and I was driving from Seattle to Minneapolis for a job interview. My ancient Toyota Corolla was packed with everything I owned, which wasn't much. The interview was on the 29th, and I was determined to make it, despite the winter storm warnings. The trouble started around 8 p.m., just past Bozeman. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, but now it was coming down in sheets, the kind that turn your high beams into a white wall. I should have stopped, found a motel, waited it out. Instead, I kept driving, squinting through the windshield and praying I could at least make it to Billings. My GPS had stopped working an hour ago, just frozen on the last known location. My phone showed no signal. The radio picked up nothing but static, occasionally broken by bursts of what sounded like old-time country music. The mile markers were covered in snow, and I had no idea how far I'd gone. That's when I saw the hitchhiker. He appeared suddenly in my headlights, a tall figure in a dark coat, arm outstretched. I drove past, heart pounding. Who would be out hitchhiking in this weather? But when I checked my rearview mirror, he was gone. Not walking away, not obscured by snow, just gone. 5 minutes later, I saw him again. Same pose, same coat, same impossible appearance in my headlights. This time, I slowed down, more from shock than any intention to stop. As I passed him, I caught a glimpse of his face. His skin was blue-white, like packed snow, and his eyes reflected my headlights like an animal's. I pressed the accelerator, trying to put distance between us. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The temperature gauge on my dashboard was dropping rapidly, even though I had the heat on full blast. Frost started forming on the inside of my windows. When I saw him a third time, I wasn't surprised. But this time, he was facing the wrong way, toward my approaching car instead of away from it. As I drove past, his head turned to follow my movement, neck rotating too far to be natural. The radio crackled to life. Through the static, I heard a voice. Take the next exit. Last chance before Dead Man's Curve. I hadn't seen an exit in miles, but suddenly there it was, a snow-covered ramp leading into darkness. The sign was unreadable beneath its white blanket. Something told me I shouldn't take it, that exits appearing out of nowhere were bad news. But at that moment, my engine made a horrible sputtering sound, and the car began to lose power. I had no choice. I turned onto the exit. The road beyond was narrow and winding, barely visible in the snow. My dying car crept forward, engine whining in protest. After what felt like miles, I saw lights ahead. A gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly in the storm. The station looked ancient, all rusty pumps and faded signs advertising brands I'd never heard of. But it was open, and at that point, I would have accepted help from the devil himself. I parked next to the only other vehicle there, a black Cadillac that looked straight out of the 1950s, its chrome gleaming despite the weather. As I got out of my car, I noticed something odd. No snow was falling here. The air was perfectly still, though I could see the storm raging just a few hundred yards back on the highway. The station's door chimed as I entered. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with the whitest hair I'd ever seen, arranged in a perfectly smooth pompadour. His name tag read Elvis in faded letters. "Rough night for driving," he said, his voice deep and melodious. "Engine trouble?" I nodded, trying to shake off the feeling that something was very wrong about this place. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting strange shadows in the corners of the store. "Lucky you found us," Elvis continued. "Not many folks make it to safety before Dead Man's Curve. Nasty stretch of road up ahead. Seen lots of accidents over the years. I need to get to Billings," I said. "Can you help with my car?" Elvis smiled, showing too many teeth. "Oh, your car's fine now, but you might want to wait out the storm. We've got coffee, fresh pie, made by my wife, Marie. She's been making the same recipe for 60 years. As if on cue, a door behind the counter opened, and a woman emerged. She looked about 30, wearing a 1950s waitress uniform, complete with a paper hat. Her name tag also read Marie, but there was something wrong with her face. It seemed to shift slightly when she moved, like a badly tuned TV signal. "Pie's ready," she said, her voice echoing strangely. "Special recipe. Been serving it since 1957. That's when I noticed the newspaper rack near the door. Every paper showed the same date, December 27th, 1957. The headlines all spoke of a terrible accident on Dead Man's Curve, where an entire family had vanished in a snowstorm. "You're not real," I whispered. "None of this is real." Elvis's smile widened impossibly. "Real as anything else on this road, honey. More real than most. We've been here a long time, keeping folks safe from the curve. Some stay, some go. Choice is yours. I looked outside. The black Cadillac was now covered in snow, its windows dark with age. Through the falling flakes, I could see other cars appearing in the lot, dozens of them, from every decade, all slowly being reclaimed by time and weather. The hitchhiker, I said. He's warning people, isn't he? Trying to keep them away from here. Marie laughed, the sound like breaking glass. Poor David, still trying to save everyone, even after all these years. He was our first customer, you know? Such a shame about his family. I backed toward the door, but Elvis was suddenly beside me, though I hadn't seen him move. Can't let you leave yet, darling. Storm's too bad. Besides, you haven't tried the pie. The pie sat on the counter now, though I hadn't seen Marie put it there. Steam rose from it, but the steam moved wrong, spiraling up in impossible patterns. The filling was dark, almost black, and seemed to be moving. Just one bite, Marie coaxed. Everyone takes one bite. Then they understand. Then they stay. Through the window, I could see my car. The snow was beginning to cover it, just like all the others. If I didn't leave now, it would become just another relic in their collection. I ran. Behind me, I heard Elvis and Marie calling out, their voices distorting into something inhuman. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. The engine started immediately, purring like it was brand new. I reversed frantically, tires spinning on the snow-covered pavement. As I turned back toward the highway, I caught a final glimpse of the gas station in my rearview mirror. Elvis and Marie stood in the doorway, their forms flickering like bad television reception. Behind them, shadows moved in the windows, pressing against the glass, shapes that might once have been human. I drove back to the highway in a daze, expecting at every moment to find myself trapped in an endless loop or facing the hitchhiker again. But suddenly I was back on the main road, and my GPS was working. According to it, no time had passed since it had lost signal. The storm was gone. The road ahead was clear, and my engine ran perfectly all the way to Minneapolis. I made it to my interview on time, got the job, and tried to convince myself that what I'd experienced was just a stress-induced hallucination. But sometimes, on cold nights, my radio picks up snatches of old country music, playing through the static. And every year, on December 27th, I get a piece of mail with no return address. Inside is always the same thing. A simple recipe card, yellowed with age, titled Marie's Special Pie. The ingredients list is blank except for a single line at the bottom that reads serves forever. I've researched that stretch of highway extensively since then. There are records of dozens of disappearances over the years, all on snowy nights, all near what locals call Dead Man's Curve. The first was in 1957, a family of 4 in a black Cadillac and a lone hitchhiker who vanished while trying to warn them. The gas station appears in only one photograph, taken in 1957. It shows a young couple standing proudly in front of their new business. Their names were Elvis and Marie Thompson. They vanished the same night as the family in the Cadillac, though their bodies were never found. The gas station itself burned down in 1958, and nothing was ever built on that site again. But I know they're still there, Elvis and Marie, forever young in their own pocket of time, still serving their special pie to stranded travelers, still collecting cars and souls in their snow-covered lot. And somewhere on that dark road, a hitchhiker with snow-white skin still tries to warn people away, seeking redemption for the family he couldn't save. So if you're driving through Montana on a snowy night, and your GPS stops working, pay attention to any hitchhikers you see. And if someone offers you pie at a gas station that shouldn't exist, remember, some places serve a kind of hospitality you can never leave behind. Sometimes the safest path is the one that goes straight through the storm, no matter how dark the road ahead might seem. Because on some highways, the real danger isn't in what might run you off the road. It's in the refuges you find along the way, and the price they ask for keeping you safe from the storm. The rental car's GPS died somewhere between Las Vegas and Death Valley. I wasn't worried at first. I had my phone as backup, and the route was simple enough. Just follow Route 95 south until it met Interstate 15. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert. My phone's signal disappeared too. That's when the radio started picking up a station it shouldn't have been able to receive. You're listening to KDTH, Death Valley's only radio station. A woman's voice crackled through the speakers. It's 7:15 p.m. on this beautiful evening, and we've got a special request coming up for all you lonely travelers out there. I frowned. The clock on my dashboard read 5:45 p.m. The voice continued. This one goes out to Sarah Chun, making her way home on Route 95. Honey, you might want to take the next turn. The usual way home isn't safe tonight. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. That was my name. I hadn't told anyone I was driving this route. I'd made the decision impulsively after my flight was canceled, renting a car for the 6-hour drive rather than waiting 2 days for the next available flight. A song started playing, something old and scratchy that sounded like it was being broadcast from the 1950s. Through the static, I could barely make out the lyrics. The long way home is the safe way home. When darkness falls on Devil's Road. I switched off the radio, but it clicked back on by itself. The woman's voice returned. Sarah, honey, this is your last chance. Turn right at the Joshua tree. You'll know the one. Ahead of me, a massive Joshua tree appeared, its twisted limbs silhouetted against the darkening sky. It stood alone, far larger than any others I'd seen. At its base was an unmarked dirt road heading east. I drove past it. The radio burst into static, then silence. When it came back on, the woman's voice was different, harder, colder. You should have listened, Sarah. They never listen. The sun disappeared behind the mountains with unnatural speed, plunging the desert into darkness. My headlights seemed dimmer than they should have been, barely penetrating the gloom ahead. The temperature dropped rapidly, frost forming on the windows despite the warm air outside. That's when I saw the other car. It appeared in my rearview mirror without warning. An old black Cadillac, its chrome gleaming despite the darkness. Its headlights were off, but I could see 3 figures inside, their faces pale smudges in the gloom. The Cadillac pulled alongside me, keeping perfect pace. The driver turned to look at me, a woman in what appeared to be 1950s clothing, her face a mask of concern. She mouthed something I couldn't understand and pointed ahead frantically. I looked forward just in time to see a massive truck materialize out of the darkness, driving straight at me in my lane. I swerved hard, tires screeching on the asphalt. When I recovered control, both the truck and the Cadillac were gone. The radio crackled again. First warning, the woman said. 2 more to go. Pull over now, Sarah. Please. I pressed the accelerator harder, pushing the rental car to its limits. The desert beyond my headlights had changed. The Joshua trees now looked like reaching hands, their branches clawing at the sky. The mountains in the distance seemed closer than they should have been, their shapes wrong somehow. The Cadillac appeared again, this time ahead of me. It was driving backward, keeping pace perfectly as its driver continued to mouth silent warnings. In the back seat, I could now see a child pressing her hands against the window, her face twisted in terror. Another truck materialized, this one even closer. I wrenched the wheel, nearly hitting the Cadillac as I swerved. When I straightened out, I was alone on the road again. Second warning, the radio announced. 1 more chance, Sarah. The long way home is better than no way home at all. The Joshua tree appeared again ahead of me, the same one I'd passed miles ago. Impossible. The dirt road at its base seemed to glow faintly in my headlights. I drove past it again. The radio died completely this time. In the sudden silence, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Children singing, their voices coming from somewhere behind me. The long way home is the safe way home. When darkness falls on Devil's Road, the short way takes what it wants to take and keeps what it claims as its own. I checked my rearview mirror. The back seat was empty, but the singing continued, growing louder. The temperature inside the car dropped further, my breath now visible in the air. The Cadillac appeared one final time, but now it was different. Its chrome was rusted, its windows shattered. The woman driver's face had decayed to bone, but her mouth still moved, still trying to warn me. The child in the back seat was gone, leaving only a small handprint on the frosted window. A wall of headlights appeared ahead. Not one truck but dozens, materializing out of the darkness like a tsunami of metal and light. I slammed on the brakes, but nothing happened. The pedal went straight to the floor, useless. The radio burst back to life, the woman's voice now filled with sadness. Final warning, Sarah. Some roads remember what they take. Some roads want more. And this one has been hungry for a very long time. The headlights grew closer, and I realized I could see through them. See the other accidents happening simultaneously, overlapped like multiple exposures in a photograph. I saw the Cadillac swerving to avoid a truck that hadn't existed in 1957. I saw a family in a station wagon meeting their end in 1963. I saw every death this road had claimed, playing out in endless loops. At the last possible moment, the steering wheel turned by itself, wrenching the car onto a dirt road that hadn't been there seconds before. The parade of phantom vehicles roared past behind me, their light and noise fading into the desert night. The car rolled to a stop by a small building that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. A faded sign read KDTH Radio. The voice of Death Valley. The woman from the radio was waiting outside. She looked solid enough, but I could see stars through her body. "You almost waited too long," she said. "They usually do." "Who are you?" I managed to ask. "Just another traveler who didn't listen," she replied. "I've been broadcasting warnings since 1957. Some nights are worse than others. Tonight," she looked up at the sky, which had turned an impossible color. "Tonight is the worst I've seen in years." "The Cadillac," I said. "That was you?" She nodded. "Me, my husband, our daughter. We were the first. There have been others. So many others. Those trucks aren't trucks at all. They're just how it chooses to appear, how it likes to hunt. The road." She turned to look back toward Route 95, her form flickering like bad reception. "Some places are hungry. This stretch of highway, it's been feeding for longer than anyone knows. Native Americans used to avoid this whole area, said the land itself was wrong here. How do I get home?" She pointed to a narrow dirt track leading east. "That road will take you to Interstate 15. It's longer, but it's safe. The entity that haunts Route 95 can't follow you there." She paused, her image starting to fade. "But before you go, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Next time you hear my broadcast, listen. The warning isn't just for you. It's for everyone. Some nights, when the road is really hungry, I can't reach people in time. Sometimes all I can do is watch them join the parade." She was almost invisible now, her voice becoming static. "Remember, Sarah, the long way home is always better than no way home at all." I followed the dirt road east. It took 3 extra hours to reach Interstate 15, but I made it home safely. I tried researching the incident later, looking up accidents on that stretch of Route 95. I found records of the woman and her family, Margaret, James, and little Susan Wells, who vanished on a desert road in 1957. Their car was never found. I've made that drive many times since then, always during daylight, always taking the interstate. But sometimes, late at night, my car radio picks up a familiar station. I hear Margaret's voice warning other travelers, trying to save them from her fate. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, I swear I can see headlights in my rearview mirror. A black Cadillac keeping pace, its passengers forever trying to prevent their tragedy from repeating. The official maps show Route 95 as a normal highway, but locals know better. They call it Devil's Road, and they only drive it during the day. Because when night falls, the road remembers all it has taken, and it grows hungry for more. So if you're driving through Death Valley after dark, and you hear a woman's voice on the radio warning you to take another route, listen to her. Some roads lead home, and some lead somewhere else entirely. And sometimes, the longest way home is the only way to get there at all. The first time I saw the girl on Highway 61, I thought she was just another hitchhiker. She stood by mile marker 237, her red dress bright against the gray Mississippi twilight, thumb extended hopefully. I didn't stop. You don't pick up hitchhikers when you're driving alone at dusk, especially not on a stretch of road nicknamed the Blues Highway. The second time I saw her, 20 miles later, I knew something was wrong. She wore the same red dress, had the same long dark hair, stood in exactly the same pose. But this time, as I drove past, she turned to watch my car. Her head rotated too far, like an owl's, and her eyes reflected my headlights like mirrors. I was driving from New Orleans to Memphis, taking the famous Highway 61 because I'd always wanted to see it. Growing up on blues music, I'd heard all the legends about this road. About Robert Johnson selling his soul at the crossroads, about ghostly musicians playing at midnight, about travelers who disappeared and were never seen again. But I didn't believe in ghost stories. Not then. The third time I saw her, the sun had fully set. She stood by mile marker 197, which made no sense. The numbers should have been getting higher as I drove north, not lower. When I passed her this time, she smiled. Her teeth were sharp, like needles. I pressed the accelerator harder, trying to outrun whatever game this was. The radio, which had been playing classic blues all evening, suddenly filled with static. Through the white noise, I heard a voice. Mile marker 0 is waiting. Mile marker 0 is hungry. I checked my GPS, but the screen had frozen. My phone showed no signal. The mile markers continued counting down. 175, 162, 144. Impossible numbers for where I should have been. That's when I noticed the other cars. They appeared in my rearview mirror, a parade of vehicles from different eras, a 1950s Chevrolet, a 1970s Volkswagen bus, a 1990s sedan. All of them had their headlights off. All of them were keeping perfect pace with my car, no matter how fast I drove. The girl appeared again, this time standing in the middle of the road. I swerved to avoid her, but she vanished like smoke as my car passed through where she had been standing. The radio crackled. Getting closer now. Can you feel it? Mile marker 0 has been waiting such a long time. The temperature inside my car dropped dramatically. Frost formed on the windows despite the warm spring night outside. The parade of cars behind me grew longer, and now I could see their drivers, pale faces with mirror eyes, all smiling with needle teeth. Mile marker 87 passed, then 65, then 42. The sky had changed. No stars were visible, just an endless black void. The landscape outside had transformed too. Instead of Mississippi farmland, twisted trees lined the road, their branches reaching like claws toward my car. The girl appeared every few miles now, each time closer to my car, each time more wrong. Her dress became tattered, her skin grew gray, but her smile widened impossibly with each appearance. The other cars began pulling alongside me, their drivers turning to stare with those mirror eyes. Mile marker 23. The radio spoke again, but now it was the girl's voice. Do you know why they call it the Blues Highway? Not because of the music, because of what happens to travelers who drive it alone at night, because of how they feel when they realize they can never leave. Mile marker 15. The cars around me started honking their horns in rhythm, a bizarre melody that sounded like a distorted version of an old blues song. I recognized it, Hellhound on My Trail by Robert Johnson. The girl appeared in my back seat. Mile marker 0 is almost here, she whispered, her breath frosting the rearview mirror. Would you like to know what happens there? Would you like to know why none of us can leave? I slammed on the brakes, but nothing happened. The pedal went straight to the floor. The steering wheel turned to ice under my hands. Mile marker 7. The other cars pressed closer, herding me down the center of the highway. Their drivers were singing now, their voices a chorus of whispers. The road goes on forever, but the party never ends. At mile marker 0, where the highway bends, where the blues were born and the crossroads meet, where the devil takes his toll in souls sweet and deep. Mile marker 3. The girl's reflection appeared in every mirror, her face multiplying like a kaleidoscope of horror. Her voice came from everywhere at once. They say Robert Johnson sold his soul at the crossroads, but that's not quite right. The crossroads is just where the highway tastes you. Mile marker 0 is where it decides to keep you. Mile marker 1. The other cars suddenly pulled ahead, forming a barrier across the road. As they stopped, their forms shifted, metal and glass melting together into a wall of chrome and teeth. The last mile marker appeared, 0. The highway itself seemed to rise up, asphalt flowing like water, forming a tunnel of darkness ahead. The girl's laugh echoed from every direction as my car was pulled forward by an irresistible force. "Welcome home," she whispered. "Welcome to where the blues began. Welcome to where they'll never end." My car plunged into the darkness. I felt a sensation like falling, like being torn apart and reassembled. When my vision cleared, I was still on Highway 61. But it was different. The sky was permanently twilight, the trees were always reaching, and mile marker 0 stood eternally ahead, never getting closer no matter how long I drove. The girl sat beside me now, her red dress fresh and new again. "Don't worry," she said, smiling with those needle teeth. "You'll get used to it. We all do. And soon you'll help us welcome others." The highway is always hungry for more musicians in its endless blues band. That was 3 years ago, or maybe 30, or 300. Time doesn't work right here at mile marker 0. We drive endlessly, playing our brutal blues for travelers who stray onto this stretch of Highway 61 after dark. Sometimes they escape. Usually they don't. So if you're driving the blues highway at night, and you see a girl in a red dress hitchhiking, don't stop. If you notice the mile markers counting down instead of up, turn around while you still can. And if you hear strange music on your radio, voices singing about mile marker 0, pull over at the nearest town and wait for dawn. Because some highways don't just connect places, they collect souls. Some roads don't end. They simply loop forever through the darkness. And sometimes, the blues you hear late at night aren't songs at all, they're warnings. Echoing from a place where the music never stops and the party never ends. A place called mile marker 0, where every night is endless and every traveler eventually learns to play in the devil's own blues band. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but I need to get it off my chest. What happened last December changed everything I thought I knew about human nature and about myself. It started innocently enough. I had just moved to Seattle for my dream job at a tech startup, and that's where I met Marcus. He was charming, brilliant, and seemed absolutely perfect. We clicked instantly over our shared love of vintage video games and horror movies. After 3 months of dating, everything was going great. At least, that's what I thought. The trouble began when I decided to surprise Marcus for his birthday. He had mentioned growing up in Portland and being obsessed with this obscure Japanese gaming console from the 90s, the Neo Geo. He told me stories about playing it at his grandmother's house before she passed away, and how he'd never been able to find one since. I spent weeks scouring online marketplaces until I finally found someone selling one locally. The seller, Chris, lived just outside the city. We arranged to meet at a local coffee shop, but when he arrived, something felt off. He was perfectly pleasant, but he kept staring at me with this strange intensity that made my skin crawl. Still, the console was in pristine condition, and I knew Marcus would love it. That night, I started getting anonymous text messages. Just random strings of numbers at first, then pictures of empty rooms in what looked like an old house. I blocked the number, but the messages kept coming from new ones. I convinced myself it was just spam, even though something in my gut told me otherwise. A week before Marcus's birthday, he suggested we take a trip to Portland to visit his family. "They're dying to meet you," he said with an odd glint in his eye. "Mom's planning something special." I was nervous but excited. Meeting the family felt like a big step forward. The morning of our drive, Marcus picked me up early. I had wrapped the Neo Geo carefully and hidden it in my overnight bag, planning to surprise him when we arrived. But something was different about him that morning. His usual warm smile seemed forced, almost mechanical. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Everything okay?" I asked as we merged onto I-5 South. "Perfect," he replied, but his voice was flat. Just perfect. An hour into the drive, I noticed we weren't on I-5 anymore. We were on some narrow back road, trees pressing in on both sides. "Shortcut," Marcus said before I could ask. "Much more scenic this way." The trees grew denser, and my phone signal disappeared. That's when Marcus started talking, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before. "Did you enjoy your coffee date last week?" My heart stopped. "What?" "With Chris, the guy selling the Neo Geo. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" I felt my blood run cold. How did he know about that? "Marcus, that wasn't." "Don't lie to me." He slammed his hand against the steering wheel. I saw the messages. What messages? On his phone. All those pictures he sent you. The ones of my grandmother's house. My mind raced, trying to piece it together. The anonymous messages, the empty rooms. Your grandmother's house? I don't understand. Marcus laughed, but it wasn't his usual warm chuckle. It was hollow, unhinged. Chris was my cousin. I asked him to find you, to test you, and you failed. Just like all the others. The car accelerated, trees blurring past. I grabbed the dashboard. Marcus, you're scaring me. Please slow down. My name isn't Marcus. His voice was ice cold now. It's William. Marcus was my brother. He disappeared 10 years ago, along with his girlfriend. They never found their bodies. Terror gripped me as I realized the magnitude of what was happening. This man I thought I knew, the person I'd been dating for months, was a complete stranger. The police thought I did it, he continued, his voice rising. They questioned me for weeks, but they couldn't prove anything. They never found the evidence. Never found the others either. Others? My voice was barely a whisper. You really should have done your research better. Checked the news archives. 5 missing persons cases in the last decade. All couples. All disappeared on their way to Portland. The car swerved violently as he turned onto an even narrower road. Through the trees, I could see the glint of water, a lake or river. But you were different, he said, his voice softening momentarily. I thought maybe you were the one who would understand, who would pass the test. But you're just like them, meeting strange men in coffee shops, keeping secrets. The Neo Geo, I stammered. It was supposed to be your birthday present. That's all it was. Please, I can prove it. It's in my bag. He laughed again, that horrible empty sound. Oh, I know all about the console. Did Chris tell you where it came from? It was my grandmother's. The same one Marcus and I used to play. The one that disappeared the night they did. My hand crept toward the door handle, but he noticed. In one swift motion, he pressed a button, and I heard the locks click. We're almost there, he said. Almost home. Through the trees, I could make out the shape of an old house perched on the edge of the water. My blood ran cold as I recognized it from the anonymous photos, the empty rooms, the peeling wallpaper. Your grandmother's house, I whispered. Smart girl. This is where it all started. Where Marcus brought his girlfriend. Where they all end up eventually. The car was speeding up, heading straight for the water. I had seconds to act. In desperation, I reached for my bag in the back seat, grabbed the wrapped console, and swung it as hard as I could at his head. The impact caused him to jerk the wheel. The car skidded, tires losing grip on the wet ground. We spun once, twice, then crashed through the guardrail. But instead of plunging into the water, we hit a tree, hard. The airbags deployed, filling the car with white powder. Through the haze, I could see William was unconscious, blood trickling from his temple. My hands shook as I fought with the door lock, finally managing to force it open. I stumbled out of the car and ran, my legs barely holding me up. Behind me, I heard movement, then his voice. You can't escape. They never escape. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through undergrowth, branches whipping my face. I could hear him pursuing, his footsteps getting closer. The house loomed ahead of me, my only option. I burst through the front door, taking in the familiar empty rooms from the photos. But now I could see details the pictures hadn't shown. Scratch marks on the walls, dark stains on the floorboards, a pervasive smell of decay. His footsteps thundered up the porch steps. In panic, I ran for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. At the top, I froze. The hallway was lined with doors, but one stood open, revealing a room filled with old video game consoles. Dozens of them, arranged in neat rows. Neo Geos, all exactly the same model. Do you understand now? His voice came from behind me. Every console, every test, every failure. They all end up here. I turned slowly. William stood at the top of the stairs, blood running down his face, his eyes wild. In his hand was a knife. But you're different, he said, stepping closer. You fought back, just like Marcus did, at the end. Maybe that's why I chose you. Maybe that's why you'll be the last one. He lunged forward, but but I was ready. I grabbed the nearest console and hurled it at him. He stumbled, losing his balance. I shoved past him, but he caught my ankle. We both fell, tumbling down the stairs in a violent cascade. We landed hard at the bottom. Pain shot through my body, but adrenaline kept me moving. I scrambled to my feet, but William was faster. He grabbed my hair, yanking me back. "Together forever," he whispered, raising the knife. At that moment, the front door burst open. Flashlight beams cut through the gloom, and voices shouted, "Police! Drop the weapon!" William's grip loosened in surprise, and I wrenched free. As officers swarmed in, I saw Chris step through the door, his badge visible on his belt. "Sorry it took so long," he said, helping me up. We had to wait until we had enough evidence, until he let us hear himself. Later, I learned the truth. Chris wasn't William's cousin. He was an undercover detective who'd been working the case for years. The anonymous messages hadn't come from William. They'd been from the police, documenting the house while building their case. They'd known about William for years, but couldn't prove anything until they caught him in the act. They found evidence of everything in that house. The missing couples, Marcus and his girlfriend, all of them. William had been living out the same scenario over and over, trying to recreate whatever happened that first night with his brother. It's been 6 months since that day. I'm in therapy now, working through the trauma. Sometimes I still wake up in cold sweats, remembering the empty rooms, the rows of identical consoles, the look in William's eyes when he revealed his true self. But the hardest part isn't the nightmares or the panic attacks. It's the knowledge that for 3 months, I shared my life with a monster and never saw it. That's the real horror. Not knowing if the people closest to us are wearing masks, playing roles, hiding darkness behind their smiles. I don't date anymore. I'm not sure I ever will again. But I did keep one thing from that day. The Neo Geo from my bag, the one I used to save my life. It sits on my shelf now, a reminder that sometimes the perfect gift isn't what it seems. Sometimes it's just another prop in someone else's twisted game. And sometimes, the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding in the darkness. They're the ones hiding in plain sight, wearing familiar faces, calling themselves by false names, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal their true nature. The police never found all the consoles William collected. They say some are still out there, being sold online, passing from hand to hand. So if you're ever browsing marketplace ads and see a vintage Neo Geo for sale, think twice before meeting the seller. You never know who might be waiting on the other side of that coffee shop door, wearing a mask of normalcy, planning their next perfect game. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you love hearing these stories. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe for more and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.